Good morning.
Cecil.
Indeed. Good morning, my lady. May I call Professor Dame Angela McLean, please?
Repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Indeed, Professor, thank you for your assistance this morning, and indeed you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry as well. That's dated the 19th of October 2023, so earlier this year. It runs to some 51 pages, at the conclusion of which there is a statement of truth and your signature. Can I just ask you to confirm that the contents are true?
Yes, the contents are true.
Now, if you can keep your voice up, not least because we have a transcript being made at the same time, and so it may be that points that we need to take things slightly more slowly, so we'll try to maintain a reasonable speed and pace. If I ask you to slow down, it would be my fault. Similarly, we will take a break at some point this morning. So, Professor McLean, you are currently the UK's government's Chief Scientific Advisor, is that right?
Yes.
And that is a position that you've held since the 3rd of April of this year. You succeeded Professor Sir Patrick Vallance.
Yes.
Previously, you've occupied a number of roles, both in government but also within academia.
Yes.
You were formerly the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Ministry of Defence.
Yes.
And indeed, you were at the time and the period with which the inquiry is concerned with regard to the Covid-19 response.
Yes, that's right.
And at that point, you also acted as the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor from spring of 2020.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. In terms of your professional background, were also a Professor of Mathematical Biology, and that's where your expertise lies, is that right?
Yes.
At Oxford University, and you hold a number of fellowships in that regard.
Yes.
If I may now turn to the pandemic response itself and your involvement in the various scientific advisory bodies at that stage, you were a participant in SAGE.
I was.
And that ran from the 11th of February of 2020 all the way through to the 10th of February 2022.
Yes.
In conjunction with that, were you also the co-chair of SPI-M?
That's right, I was the co-chair from the 27th of March 2020.
And that again ran throughout that period until the conclusion of the committee in spring of 2022.
Yes.
You're also involved in some task and finish groups. Can you just give a very brief outline as to what those were?
Yes, there were 3 of those. So the first one was on mass testing. We did that in August of 2020. The second one we always called the Four Nations task and finish group. That was looking at what happened before and after the tiers were put in. And then there was one on about the science of vaccination, although, of course, most of the advice, the great majority of the advice about vaccination was handled separately by JCVI.
Indeed. And we will return to the second of those, the impact of interventions, the Four Nations task and finish group in due course. But you cover the other 2 within your statement. I don't propose to take you to those today. With regard to providing scientific advice to government, did you at any point attend COBRA, Cabinet, COVID-O or COVID-S?
I think I went to a small number of COVID-O meetings, none of the others.
And with regard to the later stages of the pandemic, was your involvement with the Covid-19 task force?
So later on in the pandemic, towards the end of that first year, COVID-19 task force analytics became a really important part of our lives as advisors because it formed a really fantastic sort of network for collaborators. So that was headed up by a man called Rob Harrison. And so I think sort of from about December, maybe 2020, I started going to their morning meeting every day.
And again, we will turn to that in a little bit more detail when we come to discussing the roadmap out of lockdown in 2021. So just very briefly with respect to SAGE, You attended a significant number, some 89 of those SAGE meetings throughout that period. Initially, that was as the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Ministry of Defence, but subsequently as a consequence of your role as co-chair, is that right, of SPI-M?
Right.
What was your role within SAGE at that time?
So my role in SAGE at that time was like other people. It was to listen to other people's evidence, so evidence that was being brought to SAGE by attendees that day, and challenge it like any scientist would challenge other scientists. Once I was the co-chair of SPI-MO, it was also to support my co-chair, Graham Medley. Sometimes if he wasn't there, I would present the SPI-MO consensus. And then an important part of the work would be to listen very carefully, because straight after SAGE, we co-chairs and the SPI-MO Secretariat would sit down and think through, right, what's the new commissions that come out of that? What questions arose in SAGE this week that we think SPI-MO should start working on and thinking about?
Do you consider that to be a strength of the SAGE system, that the co-chairs of the various committees sat on it and then had these follow-up sessions?
I would say that was a strength, yes.
And then in terms of SPI-MO, again, a large number of meetings, 81 during that period as the co-chair, alongside Professor Graham Medley, who we've also heard from, as you will know, earlier in the inquiry. And what was your role? So, as co-chair of SPI-MO, what was your role as distinct from that of Professor Medley?
So I think my main role was really to be the go-between. I was the person who was at SPI-M meetings, very involved in the work they had done and were going to do, but also with lots of access to the relevant civil servants, so particularly in CCS, what is CCS? That's Civil Contingency Secretariat to start with, and then later on in Covid-19 Task Force, and then particularly in Covid-19 Task Force Analytics. So lots of that, but then also supporting Graham in devising workflow, like I just described. I was often there I was always there when I was available for the main meeting. So SPI-MO had a main meeting, ended up being on a Wednesday, to support Graham, to be listening very carefully to make sure our consensus statement did reflect the discussion. Quite often I would be the one who said, listen, guys, that you think that's interesting, but I can tell you that is not interesting with respect to this particular policy question. You know, they're academics, friends of mine, they would get very interested in some particular detail, and I would sometimes say, sorry, but move on. And on the other side, quite often they would say, oh, but that's obvious. About something that they felt was very obvious just from what they knew about epidemiology, and I would have to say, well, that's obvious to you, but actually it's not obvious to lots of extremely well-informed people who are absolutely involved in managing this pandemic.
With regard, sorry, if I may just pause you there, just to pick up on that, with regard to your input from that perspective, was that very much based upon your role and interaction within government as a Chief Scientific Advisor?
Very much so. I'd been in the civil service since that September, but I had also done quite a lot of work over the years as an academic advising into government, because there are lots of mechanisms where government reaches out for academic advice. So it wasn't just those 6 months. I'd also done quite a lot of advisory work beforehand. So I think I probably had more experience, particularly perhaps with civil servants who weren't completely steeped in public health than some of my colleagues on SPI-MO did.
And with that role in terms of policy development and having that understanding, did you find that you were predominantly, therefore, involved in commissioning exercises and being that bridge between government and SPI-MO?
I did have a lot to do with commissioning exercises, particularly early on. I thought Graham put it very well when he said that I was able to talk about things that modelling could do and things that modelling could not do. I remember many discussions where I said, that's just not a good question to bring to SPI-MO. Don't ask them that. And then quite often, you can imagine, we would have a conversation where I would say, well, why are you asking that question? What is the policy decision you've got to make here? Is there another way we can frame that question into something that epidemiology, analysis and modelling can help you?
Can I just ask you just to slow down slightly, yes. Professor McLean?
I think we had 3 minds all in a second.
Indeed. Just because, as I say, there is a note being taken, and as I say, it will be my fault rather than yours. So just picking up on that, what were the initial problems that you saw with commissioning?
So early on with commissioning, so remember this would be, when I say early on, this is from the 27th of March onwards, so actually after the first lockdown was in place. Commissions arrived from all over the place. So particularly we would get commissions from Civil Contingency Secretariat and Number 10, and we didn't know how, and we wouldn't know how to prioritise those. And sometimes we would get commissions that would string several sort of, please tell us about option A and or option B, that's 3 possibilities, and then string those together for sort of 3 or 4 different things, and quite soon we'd get to sort of 100 or so possibilities. And it was my job to say, I'm really sorry, but in a week we can't do that. What do you really care about? How will you prioritise these questions? Let's turn this into something where we can actually help you.
And did that process firstly improve as the pandemic progressed?
It got much better. So SAGE Secretariat basically built a commissioning system, which one of the things it did was to stop just sort of commissions just arriving sort of from left field from Department X or Ministry Y. So they really helped us a lot by effectively making some rules of the road about how commissioning would work. And then, yes, I felt that my growing relationship with CTS meant that we got better at shared language and me understanding more why they were asking their questions, them understanding more what kind of thing we in SPI-M could and could not do.
Thank you. And if I may just pick up then, in terms of those difficulties that were initially experienced with a lack of understanding, you undertook a number of initiatives, would that be fair to say, to try to assist civil servants and policymakers and indeed decision makers in their understanding of both scientific concepts but also the outputs of SPI-M and SAGE?
Yes, we put lots of work into that.
And just to give a few examples of those very briefly, you were responsible for producing explainer documents.
We did.
Very short, pithy documents explaining things such as the reproduction number, the R, or the R number as it's been referred to, general principles and assumptions on transmission, introduction to epidemiological modelling, which we've all had sight of, and indeed further, an FAQ on epi modelling, to try to imbue some further understanding effectively within the civil service and indeed those decision makers.
That's right.
And did you see the fruit of that effectively?
I think we did, yes. I think the discourse became much better informed on both sides.
And in addition to that, and I appreciate some of us are not so familiar with graphs and graphical representations, but one of the other main developments throughout that period in terms of communication of scientific advice and the outputs of SAGE and SPI-M was the production of something that became known as ready reckoners. And again, that was something initially pulled together by Professor Brooks Pollock.
That's right.
Within SPI-M and
yes.
taken forward by you as co-chair.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a good shorthand way of putting it. I think generally in SPI-M and then in SAGE, it was felt, yes, this is a useful way of making lots of comparisons all on one page without having to draw thousands of squiggly lines.
Indeed, and perhaps we could just have a very quick look at perhaps one of the earliest iterations of that, and that's INQ 000216286. If we can go over the page, please. What we see here are a sequence of graphs that deal with issues in terms of schools and the mixing outside of home, degrees of school opening, the efficacy or otherwise of contact tracing, and then MPIs that are in place. And perhaps if you could just speak us very quickly or very, I say in high level, through the first of those graphs.
So, my lady, I've heard you don't like graphs, but this is a beautiful, a very beautiful graph. I think the way to look at this graph is to think about what can this remind us about how things felt on 3 different dates. So before, let's say, mid-March in 2020, we would have been on the right-hand end of, I'm looking at the left-hand graph. Okay, so the bottom axis says how much active work and leisure contact are people having. So 100 is normal everyday life. And the y-axis, the up-down axis is, what is this? Here is our R number. And
if I can just pause you just very briefly with the R number for a moment.
Good.
Based on the R number, and was that because decision makers had become familiar with that concept? Yes. It was a shorthand, effectively.
Exactly. It had turned into a shorthand for, have we got this infection under control? Is R at 1 or below 1? Or have we not got this infection under control, which was the case when R was above 1? So when R is a long way above 1, you really are in trouble.
And that's why we have the R number along the one axis,
right.
and the active work and leisure contacts on the other. And I interrupted you, so please go ahead.
Thank you. So remember, this is very early on, nobody vaccinated, the entire population susceptible to infection with bad consequences, particularly for elderly people and also for lots of other people too. So there we are, living our normal lives in late February, early March 2020. So we're far over on the right-hand side of the x-axis. All the schools are open, so the R number is somewhere between 2.5 and 3. We're in the middle of that red. We're somewhere in that red band up there on the right-hand side. And that was what was driving the rapid exponential growth that we eventually saw in the very rapid rise in hospitalizations that we saw a few weeks later. I'm going to come on later, I hope we'll come later, to where were we in the middle of the week just after the Prime Minister stood up on the 16th of March and said, please stay home.
We will be dealing with that in due course.
So under voluntary restrictions, we'll talk about, obviously it's very important where we were, but from the data we had at the time, we were probably at about 60 on the x-axis. Most children still in school, still are way above 1. And then on March the 23rd, when lockdown came in, we were more like at about, and all schools were closed, we were more like around about 20 on that x-axis, all schools closed, so in the middle of the grey band, the R number around about 0.7. So this was a very quick and easy way to see, roughly speaking, if we do the following things, what will happen. And one of the things you see from these graphs, I don't know if it's possible to zoom out a little bit, is that, well, if you compare the left-hand graph, on the top row, if you compare the left-hand graph and the right-hand graph, you can see that a little bit of contact tracing. So the right-hand graph is if contact tracing could prevent 1 in 5 onward transmissions, 20%, well, there's not a huge difference, is there? Whereas if you go to the bottom graph, if contact tracing could prevent 4 out of 5 onward transmissions, then we start to have quite a lot more room to sort of roam up and down this bottom axis. So the bottom axis is sort of how hard you have to intervene. The different bands are how much of schools are open, and the different pictures in this particular representation is how much contact tracing might we be able to build.
Indeed, and on each of the graphs it sets out what the parameters are.
Yes. So
taking the top one, we see that the grey band is school closed.
Yes.
The blue one, 50% of 5 to 11-year-olds at school, so an alternate. Yellow, the 5 to 11-year-old category at school.
Yes.
And then schools open.
Yes.
And then, as you say, you see if we go to the right one, we then see schools closed plus 20% contact tracing reduction, and so on and so forth.
And if I could add one further thing, this is actually based on data from, I think it's tens of thousands of people in something that a study that the BBC ran long before the pandemic on what kind of contacts people have with other people, of what age, in what context.
And so this was a graph, as we will come to later, that was being dealt with at a very early point in time, in fact, in the pandemic, pre-lockdown, but post-voluntary measures being announced.
I'm not sure we had this particular graph, because actually if you look at the date that these emails were written, I think I think we actually got this representation in more like May, this idea that we needed to be down around about 75% of contacts outside the home. So the idea that we need to be way, way down on, back to the top left graph, only requires a pretty straightforward calculation.
And we're going to move to exactly what that required, as I say, when we start to look perhaps slightly more chronologically at the response as opposed to these topics. And perhaps we can take that down now.
Just before you do, now I'm going to show just how bad I am with graphs. Could we have it back up again? Sorry. The left-hand graph, you've got bottom axis, you've got up to 100% contact.
Yeah.
Yet we're looking at the grey line if schools are closed.
Yes.
Well, if schools are closed, you haven't got 100% contact.
So this is active work and leisure contacts. So work, adults, leisure, everybody apart from school. So yes, you're quite right. This is apart from school. What's everybody doing apart from the children's school contacts? Thank you for reminding me to clarify that.
When I was just thinking that obviously when schools are open or schools are closed, there's an awful lot of contact that is reduced.
When schools are closed, absolutely. And I don't think that's in here. So the fact that when schools are closed, parents can't go to work, I don't think that was captured in here.
The other thing, can I just ask before, I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms.
No, not at all.
Looking again at the left-hand graph and remembering that one of the problems I have with graphs is it all depends on how big a gap you give between different measurements.
Yep.
When we look at school closures and school openings, the difference isn't perhaps as great as some of us might have expected. So if you've got, let's go for the 100% just because it's easier, 100% of other contacts, but you close schools.
Yep.
With schools closed, you're still up at an R number of over 2.
Yep. Correct.
And with schools open, you've got an R number of 3. Well, you said earlier, anything over 1, we're in trouble. So is that as great a distinction as lay people like me might have expected?
I would look at that and say only closing of schools wouldn't have helped us. Well, would have helped us very little.
Yeah.
I agree.
Right, thank you.
Perhaps that's the advantage of the ready reckoners and the visual comparators on the page, in fact. But these were incorporated as a consequence into both consensus statements and SAGE minutes.
They were.
Yeah. And just to deal perhaps and picking up with my lady's comment in relation to the gaps on graphs, certainly that is one of your primary issues with how politicians and not just politicians and decision makers, but policy makers, individuals that are not acquainted with graphs, potentially utilise them. And certainly when it comes to getting a ruler out, for example, that's a very big no-no to mark the gap between them, or indeed to take a specific point on many of the graphs that were produced by SAGE or SPI-M as being a critical, accurate point.
I think that was reflected in Graham's comment about knowing what you can't do with these things. I mean, I was showing you earlier, my version of these graphs that I'm extremely fond of and often carry around with me actually has I drew myself a little picture of a ruler with a don't go there sign on it. You know, we shouldn't use these things to say, oh, well, if we had, 45% active work and leisure rather than 40% and we could do precisely this or precisely that. That's not the point. The kind of lesson to learn from graphs like this is look how good your contact tracing needs to be before it gives you lots and lots of space to have fewer interventions in terms of how much people can be out and about.
Indeed, and was that one of the challenges that you and your colleagues faced during the pandemic in relation to the understanding of graphs and indeed numbers, statistics and other scientific data and outputs?
Yes, I think I would say it's an issue all your life as a sort of rather technical person, is that to find people as interlocutors who will listen but also challenge in a really constructive way is really important, because it's just as bad if they believe everything you say, because that's not very helpful. You need somebody. I mean, most of my academic life was done in collaboration with people who were not mathematicians, not modelers, and by far the best collaborators will listen and criticise and say, well, why did you do that? And should I really believe that, that confidence interval? How did you draw the confidence interval? So I think one of the things I would always say to any colleague is if a scientist comes and tells you something and you don't understand what they say, you must say to them, say it again. I didn't understand. It's their job. I think it's scientists' job to explain what it is that they've done.
And with regard to that point and understanding, perhaps if I can pick that up here, if I can take you to paragraph 57 of your witness statement on page 17. And we're going to turn to decision-making in respect of MPIs, as I say, in due course. But one of the factors that you identified as being a difficulty during the pandemic was the understanding of two key concepts. The first being the implications of fast exponential growth, and the second being lagged controls. Can you just explain exponential growth and its importance in this context for us, please?
Yes. So exponential growth arises when you have a process where what's fixed is not the slope of the line, but the time that it takes to double whatever the quantity you see. So exponential growth and fixed doubling times go together. So when we say the doubling time is a week, we instantly know, we're talking about exponential growth. And I think, as you heard very eloquently from Chris Whitty, exponential growth, once it gets going, grows really shockingly fast.
Exponentially.
Exponentially.
Indeed.
And lagged controls, well, that was particularly pertinent here, because what we were trying to do, we were trying to stop too many people ending up being admitted to hospital. And admission to hospital was something that we expected to happen sort of 10 or 11 days after you got infected. So if we have, the place where you could make an intervention was people getting infected, whereas the thing that you were worried about happens 10 days later. So if you wait until the thing you're worried about is really, really bad and growth is exponential and fast, you could very easily end up with things twice as bad at the hospital door, even if you put in a brilliant intervention. So this idea that things where whatever your control measure is doesn't fix your problem until 10 days later is a really important part of why this was such a difficult problem. And really, as I point out in this paragraph, needed to be understood because it made watch and wait tactics very damaging.
Indeed, the failure to take a decision or to wait is a positive decision in itself when it comes to issues of exponential growth.
Indeed.
And from your perspective, that is perhaps one of the most important lessons for the future in terms of developing that understanding. Is that right?
I think so.
And as we will see as we move chronologically through that period, that informs what you consider to be one of the most significant shortcomings in relation to decision making in both, well, to some extent in the early part of the pandemic, but certainly in the autumn period of 2020.
I agree. I think we made the same mistake 3 times.
Thank you. Now, with regard to that understanding, do you consider that that requires a scientific mindset?
No, I don't think it requires a scientific mindset. I think if you can draw it out in a picture in a way that anybody who's prepared to listen and think about it ought to be able to grasp.
Indeed, you give some examples within your witness statement of the Director General for Analysis in the Covid-19 Task Force.
Yes.
Somebody with an entirely non-scientific background, but able to pick up those concepts and work with those. Now, just picking up on the scientific mindset aspect, there are also differences that you identify in culture and approach between civil servants and indeed scientists. Perhaps if I can just break it down a little bit further into 3 categories. You have your science advisors, you then have your civil servants and policy makers, operational and taking a lead from the decision makers in government.
Yes.
So those 3 categories. And with respect to that, can I please bring up paragraph 22 on page 7 of your witness statement? Because you describe there 2 very different cultures. So perhaps turning firstly to academics and scientists, and that culture, you explain that academics tend to focus on points of disagreement, speak pointedly, directly about their views. And what was the difference, as you saw it, in terms of your interactions during this period?
So really the nicest thing that an academic can do for a colleague is point out why they're wrong before it goes out into the world and somebody unfriendly points out why they're wrong. So that was why under Graham's leadership on SPI-M, our mantra became, tell me why I'm wrong. Whereas it is very frequent in a civil service meeting that as somebody stands up, the very first thing they will say is, I agree with everything that's been said. And you're sat there thinking, well, you can't have been listening then. And I don't think they really mean it, actually. I think it's a sort of a saying that means I'm here to work with you, we've got things we've got to deliver. I might disagree with some of the details of what you said, but let's work together. And I always found it, do I still? It's always quite difficult for an academic who becomes a civil servant to understand why people are saying this sort of weirdly emollient thing when actually our values are so similar. We're trying to get at the truth. I think it's a difference between, are you really trying to get at every detail of the truth, or are you trying to make something workable that you can deliver? So I think it's summed up quite well by, tell me why I'm wrong, academics, versus I agree with everything that's been said, civil servants. I think the values are actually very close, but they're different ways of approaching working together.
And indeed, different ways of communicating.
Absolutely.
And did that cause any difficulties during the pandemic?
Yes, there were several occasions when I had to paper over the cracks, I would say, because it was usually, was it usually this way? Yes, I think it was mostly that an academic on SPI-M had told a civil servant why they were wrong in some way that the civil servant felt was rude. And so, yeah, there were occasions when I felt it was my job, I was very happy to do it, was in contact with people to say, I'm sorry that was upsetting for you, they didn't mean to be rude to you personally, what they were talking about was your work,
Indeed, and if I could just call up INQ 002-15900. It's an email with Professor Medley. And it relates to perhaps one of those scenarios that arose during the pandemic with a member of a civil servant. And within this, what we see is, it's in the top part, it's an email from you, second paragraph down. You explain that a gentleman was unhappy about SPI-M on Wednesday, so you sent him an email, which you copied into Professor Medley, just so that he was also in the loop. And you explain, I think civil servants have different ways of being robust with each other from academics. Perhaps he found our ways of expressing ourselves more direct than he is used to. No action required. And then you explain, you'll try to find out why he's uncomfortable and report back. And so is that an example of what you've been referring to? Indeed.
And I mean, what you can see here is that the wonderful Claire Gardner was able to ring me up and say, Angela, that went a bit far on Wednesday. Can you try and cheer up a bit?
And the underlying issue there was a meeting in SPI-M where members were expressing some level of frustration with the testing and tracing situation.
I believe so. Elsewhere, there's a response from saying he's not surprised people are frustrated with the progress of the test and trace system.
Now, if I may turn to a separate issue, and that's the one in relation to further attempts to assist policymakers and government decision makers in a slightly different way, and that was the creation of a toy model. And we've heard a little bit about that already, but if you could just explain very shortly in a sentence what a toy model is, please.
So a toy model, I think the phrase really comes from physicists, is an absolute caricature. It's something where you keep things as simple as possible, either perhaps so you can do some analytical calculations, on a piece of paper, or in this case, we wanted to make something that could be freely available both to policymakers and, if they wanted it, decision takers, to build their understanding and intuition about how infectious disease systems work. We knew that we couldn't build for them a full, sort of well-parameterized model with lots of the complexities about how different parts of society mix together. So we were very clear that this was a pedagogical tool.
Indeed, within the toy model documentation itself, it makes clear that it's a teaching tool.
Yeah.
It's not designed to give accurate forecasts. It's so that people can play around with it to see what the potential impacts of different interventions could be, but in a very general way.
That's right. So going back to this issue that we talked about right at the moment, right early on, that if something's growing very fast and the control lever that you have only acts with a bit of delay, you're going to get this big overshoot after you've made things better. That sort of thing. And when I say we built, it was built by a team in JBC, a very able team led by Fergus Cummings.
Indeed. And then quality assured and then sent out to various government departments.
That's right. So my role, so I was incredibly keen that they should have something that was internally correct. I mean, it wasn't a great model, but it didn't have mistakes in it. So that it could be relied on in that sense. So yes, I sent it out to be basically peer-reviewed by some academics, and it was also very carefully reviewed by some modellers at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratories.
And we've heard a little bit of evidence already in respect of Claire Lombardelli from the Treasury with regard to an email chain that you were involved in along with Philip Duffy and Ben Warner relating to Treasury playing around with it and changing that toy model. And what you say there is in relation to that is, given their inability to spot egregious errors in other things they were sent, I do not have any confidence in their ability to hack a simple, sensible model. As a consequence, anything they have to say about infectious modelling is very much on them as opposed to quality assured or endorsed by you or SPI-M.
It was me. SPI-M were actually quite clear that they felt it was not their job to quality assure government work. And I think that was right. They were already doing enough. So it was me as CSA MOD, I would say, who took this, found some of them were SPI-M members. But so that was done outside SPI-M, and I think rightly. But yes, but to go back to in the documentation, I think there are things saying, please don't change it. Yes. Because once you've changed it, it's no longer quality assured. We'd gone to a lot of trouble to make sure it was correct. So we said to people, please don't change it. Please feel free to use it however you like. It had been made into this beautiful, rather easy to use thing, I believe, although I never got to play with it myself. And I mean, that is a source of some regret to me, because if Treasury had come to us and said, oh, this is quite interesting, it doesn't quite do what we need, would you, if we make some changes to it, properly document and explain to you what we've changed, would you re-quality assure it for us? And I think I would have sighed, because it was a lot of work, but I would have done it. And actually that could have formed a basis for quite an interesting, a strong interaction.
Indeed, and one of the themes that you do refer to within your witness statement more generally in relation to HMT and Treasury is a lack of transparency over the economic modelling or advice.
Yes. I mean, I think there was an issue that the scientific advice that came through SAGE was completely transparent. Everything was in the public domain on the day that the decision was announced. And whatever modelling Treasury was doing to consider the economic case, I've still never seen.
And with regard to, you may have heard that there was some attempt at epimacro modelling by HMT,
yeah.
By Treasury. And what you do refer to in your email are egregious errors in other things. Did they have adequate or sufficient epidemiological modelling experience, in your view, to do that?
I think they could have used some more. I mean, like, in the same way that DHSC looks for outside help via SPI-M, even in peacetime, and there's plenty of good modellers in DHSC, but they have the, I think, very good sense to go to academics who are world-class leaders in the subject. So I think it would be sensible for Treasury, if they wanted epidemic models, to have reached out that way.
Thank you. And then one final topic before we turn to the governmental response and the response to COVID-19, please, and it's that of data. and data flows. And we can deal with this relatively briefly. We've heard a lot of evidence so far in relation to data and the absence of data. But that's also something that you experienced, certainly at the very beginning of the pandemic, but also throughout the pandemic, albeit getting better as the pandemic progressed. Would that be a fair summary?
Yes, that's a fair summary.
And if I can just pull up, please, the INQ 002-13194 and go to page 2. What we have here, it's the bottom of an email from you that I'm interested in. It's halfway down the page. That does bring me to the elephant in the room, Mike. This is an email exchange that's taking place towards the end of March of 2020, the 28th of March. You are going to be horrified when you find out what the data flows coming out of the NHS are like. I just want to warn you, I actually choked when Peter Bruce said SPI-M must be drowning in data. And so we are obviously at this point locked down. We're there. We still have, on your view, significant issues with the data flows coming out of the NHS. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And how did that impact upon your work at that stage?
There was real trouble with doing the sorts of analysis that we needed because the data weren't available. That's straightforward.
Thank you.
It did get much better later. So I can't remember the exact dates, but around this time, I think I never really knew what happened. It was quite sort of Elders and the Shoemaker. I came down one day and DSTL had sorted it all. I think what happened was that my very able private secretary in the Ministry of Defence, who came from the Defence Science Labs, knew that they could do this job. So what they did was they set themselves up as what I would call a data haven. Anybody would look at them and say, well, surely these people know how to keep very sensitive data secret. So they could be trusted by the NHS to take the data, clean it, make sure that nothing was identifiable to an individual on the one hand. And on the other hand, they could handle all the non-disclosure agreements that were absolutely necessary from people who are going to access that data. So they set themselves up that way, and they became the people, a main conduit, not the only conduit, but the main conduit for data, particularly out of the NHS, into the modelling groups.
So it's actually a trusted broker,
Exactly.
something of that nature.
Exactly. Yes. And actually, I mean, I would like to sing their praises because I think that act of looking after data, cleaning data, making sure that only people who should access it do access it, they are unsung heroes, those people. They weren't the modellers. The modellers could not have done their work without them.
And just picking up on two other aspects, if I may, of data, if I can call up, please, an email at INQ 61765. It's an email, again, around the same time period, 30th of March of 2020 through to the 31st, between you, Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Medley. And here, what's being flagged again is, as we see from the second email down from Graham Medley, the lack of data from devolved administrations should be highlighted. And if we go over the page, please, what we have at the end of that email, the very penultimate line before the sign-off, are key political issues that we still have no real-time data from outside of England. And so what we're seeing here are significant issues in relation potentially to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland.
That is correct.
And again, what impact did that have on the early stages, and did that position improve?
That was a difficult issue for quite some time, and it made it very difficult for SPI-M to do work that was specifically relevant to devolved administrations. It did get much better over time, and in time, particularly Scotland and Wales actually created very good analytic and modelling capability of their own, and data flows from other parts of the UK did get better.
And with respect to that sharing of data and the data flows, at what point in the pandemic did you see a significant improvement? Obviously, not necessarily the date, but just broadly.
My sense is that by mid-May it was much better. You have to understand that modellers are a bit like farmers and the weather. It's never enough data.
Of course. Did you or SPI-M or SAGE ever experience any difficulties in obtaining data from Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales, effectively, were there any blocks put in the way by any of those devolved nations, or was there a free flow of data once the capacity was there?
I don't think I can answer that question, because that would have been handled by my co-chair and the
Of
Secretariat.
course. No, thank you, Professor. Another area of data, just briefly on ethnicity, if I may. You make it plain within your witness statement that with regard to ethnicity, there was insufficient data to account for intersectional disparities, so ethnicity and indeed other aspects. Is that right?
Particularly in these main flows of data that were driving parameter estimation for the big models, yes. There were sometimes other particular questions that we could address with particular data sets, but yes, I would say in the main data streams, there wasn't enough data, and for the kinds of policy questions we were addressing, I can't think of policy questions that really would have driven that kind of modelling. So there's no point in us making a model more complicated if it isn't necessary to address a particular policy question.
Indeed. And similarly, there was an absence of data on wider societal outcomes, which feeds into those intersectional issues also.
Yes.
Sorry,
can I just?
Of course.
I don't think we're going to visit it here, but there was work done by a different group, not by SPI-M, on what Chris Whitty refers to as what we always thought of as the CMO's 4 harms. So that was handled by Ian Diamond and John Aston.
Yes.
So that the ways of accounting for the harms wider than COVID hospitalisations and deaths.
And we have heard some evidence in relation to that at the outset of this module as well, from Professor Sir Ian Diamond.
Good.
Similarly, if I may, data and care homes, just touch on that briefly here. With respect to care homes and data, were you also experiencing problems in accessing data flows and data streams?
We had very little data about outbreaks inside care homes. So for a long time, the data we tended to see was, yes, this care home is affected, no, this care home is not affected. But that made it very difficult to say anything helpful about what was happening inside care homes. We did set up a separate care homes group and had modellers specifically on there. So in a sense, the care home modelling was delegated to a different group.
Indeed. And really, I'm just dealing with the data aspect
Yes.
at this moment with you. And then perhaps we're just to round off that topic in terms of your evidence, because we've heard evidence obviously from other individuals too, Professor. But from the outset, did you expect that there would be problems arising in relation to care homes and outbreaks?
Yes. I think that was, you only have to look at historical big epidemics, particularly of respiratory infections, that you would have expected that.
And just again briefly, because there will be a module dealing with this in greater detail in due course, was outbreaks, the incidence of outbreaks and problems within care homes, was that something that was a foreseeable issue from the outset of the pandemic?
Yes.
Indeed, within both SAGE and the subgroup, we see that testing is one of the tools that is repeatedly referred to with respect to care homes.
Yes.
And that concerns were being raised within SPI-M.
Yes, that's right. It was clearly going to be an issue. Of course, at that very early stage, we did not have many tools in our pockets for helping, and testing would have been one of the few things we could do.
And were you and SPI-M concerned that not enough was being done in relation to care homes?
Yes, and I think SAGE too. I think there were SAGE comments from quite early on about how particular attention would need to be paid to care homes.
And as you've already referred to, we see that a separate subgroup, a working group, was set up specifically to deal with that issue.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if I may move now to start with the actual COVID-19 response, and so taking you back, if I may, all the way to your first interactions in terms of SAGE, which was on the 11th of February. I understand that you were aware of COVID-19 prior to that as a consequence of interaction with Professor Edmonds. And were you concerned at that stage?
I think I mentioned in my statement that on the 25th of January, I remember being at an infectious disease public understanding of science event, actually, in Oxford. So there were lots of us together, and somebody asking me about it. And I remember saying, well, John's worried, and that makes me worry. Because, we've lived through umpteen times that there's been a pandemic. And so we know how different people react. The fact that John found it worrying was a pretty strong signal, I would say, even mid-January.
And is he normally somebody that's cautious then? And so a concern in that respect would be a very significant concern.
Yes.
Now, if I may take you then to the first few weeks of March, and if I can take you to paragraph 116 of your statement, you explain that you began to feel that there did not seem to be a plan within government or a clear sense of how many people were going to die. Why was that?
Where are we? I'm just trying to look. First few weeks. It seemed incredible, and from what I've heard now, it was incredible, that there could possibly be a strategy of even a slightly mitigated epidemic. That the kinds, you've talked quite a lot about other people's calculations. We might look at some I'd made. If everybody could catch it, and it spreads quite well, so that you might expect something like 3/4 of the population to get it, even if the infection fatality rate is only 1%, that's just an unbelievably large number of people. And that was what led me to say to Ben on that one of those days, the 10th of March day, have decision takers really understood what they're confronting here?
And the 10th of March that you're referring to is a SAGE meeting.
Yeah.
And Ben is Ben Warner.
Yes.
Who was also in attendance. We also know that Professor Riley was there, Professor Ferguson.
I think Professor Riley was not there, but we spoke about an important paper of Professor Riley's.
Yes. And it was his paper that was being discussed in any event at that meeting.
The point about that paper was, remember, Professor Riley had lived and worked in Hong Kong. So he had experience that was lacking for many of us. And, he expressed this very strong view. We're going to have to go into lockdown and stay there. And so that was the 10th of March. And, I actually hadn't heard about Exercise Nimbus until I heard Ben Warner giving evidence to you. So if I'd known about Exercise Nimbus on that day, I would have thought, oh, well, they've had an exercise on it. It was a flu pandemic, but exercise, but it's still a very, very large number of deaths. So if I'd just known that Exercise Nimbus had happened, I might have been encouraged. Actually, if I'd known who went to Exercise Nimbus, I might have been a bit discouraged.
If I can just pick up on that then, please, with Exercise Nimbus. And certainly it was not the case that all of the CSAs from the various departments were present.
No.
Certainly you weren't aware of it.
No.
And so there was no opportunity to feed in from that scientific perspective.
I think GCSA was there. I think at least one of the DCMOs
from
was
the
there.
CSA, from the broader CSA community
absolutely.
within government.
Yes, that's true. I would also, the people who were present at Exercise Nimbus were not the Secretaries of State who would be sat around the cabinet table making these decisions.
And so at that point, were you concerned that government had not got a grip on the situation?
I was concerned that the people who were being asked to make these very consequential decisions that were coming our way very fast may not have got their heads round what it would feel like to have 3/4 of the population infected and 1% of them die. That's it's clearly unconscionable, whatever the word is, not something any politician could conceivably agree to. So I wasn't clear what it was they'd agreed to on that day, on the 10th.
Indeed, and as you say, that's what prompted you to speak to Ben Warner
Yes.
about whether or not those decision makers in government,
Yes.
i.e. the politicians,
Yes.
Prime Minister, and the members of the Cabinet,
Yeah.
Secretaries of State, had understood the consequences,
Yes.
the overwhelming of the NHS,
Yes.
and the tsunami of deaths that would potentially be coming
Yes.
in the way. Your involvement then continued, and indeed you attended stage 15, meeting 15, then on the 13th of March of 2020. And at that point, ICU hospital capacity was being discussed by Professor Edmonds. What was your view in relation to hospital capacity and what you knew about the potential pandemic?
So this was the first time I saw a picture that compared a potential pandemic and ICU capacity, and it was really shocking because, I mean, you've all seen it now, but it's this line right down at the bottom, not somewhere near the top. And I did also, a relative of mine was working in a London ICU then, and from what she described and from what I knew about exponential growth, you know, they didn't have many people, but if the doubling time was less than a week, it was just very obvious that they would be in big, big trouble in a few weeks' time.
Okay. And indeed, that subsequently prompted you to send Professor Sir Patrick Vallance an email. And if I can just pull that up, please, that's 195889. And this is your own calculation.
It's not a calculation, it's just a drawing.
A drawing.
I mean,
calculation places it too high. It's probably
on purpose, actually, because I was worried that people were looking at models and saying, "Oh, it's just modelling," and so I want to say this isn't really about modelling. This is about, have we somehow been making the wrong assumption about where capacity lies relative to what we're going to do? Because on Friday we've been shown the picture where the dotted line is way down the bottom, and if the dotted line is way, way down there, all this discussion about, oh, are we going to mitigate or are we going to suppress? Well, if you're going to stay below the dotted line, to mitigate is to suppress. Once you see where that lies, it's not a complicated question.
No,
if you are not going to exceed capacity.
You don't need a model. You don't need modelers.
Nope.
You just need to apply basic facts and to some extent that word common sense.
I think what modelling would help you with is this sense of how fast is it growing, how long have I got?
Indeed. And this document, you explain that you know that there are many uncertainties. You're looking at realistic current capacity versus reasonable worst case epidemiology as well within there, but really focusing in here on just NHS capacity and it being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So just interrupt again. What made you pose the question, but what if it's here, to lower the line?
The meeting that we'd had on that Friday,
What was the meeting?
where John Edmonds had shown a picture where I think he had some real data. I think it was just from one county, actually, and had drawn effectively that picture.
So who had given you the higher dotted line?
That was my interpretation of what we seemed to be saying, that the situation was going to be something where we'd make it a little bit better and then we'd stay within capacity.
And the NHS would cope effectively.
Yeah.
But actually, capacity seemed to be at quite some distance from that.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, would be overwhelmed and swamped very quickly.
But other people who are having conversations, I mean, this is me at home in Oxford, you know, doing little drawings. Other people who were in London that week were in the process of finding out how far along, in real life, how far along those lines we were, which was actually, as you heard earlier this week, the much more compelling piece of evidence.
Indeed. And if I can just then take you down slightly further on your page, this is where you set out what you consider to be the combinations of options. If capacity is nearer that low line, what other combinations of options are there? It's on the 15th of March, and we see at the top lockdown, intermittent lockdown, presumably coming into lockdown, coming out, going back into lockdown, spread out over time to achieve immunity. What does that mean?
Other ways of intermittent lockdown is one way to spread out when your infections happen. We could have thought, I'm sure if we'd applied brain, we could have thought of others.
And continue contact tracing. We'll come to that a little bit later, and then others.
Yeah.
So we see that you are flagging here to Professor Sir Patrick Vallance those options, if this is where we are.
Yeah.
You raise herd immunity, effectively to demonstrate the numbers that it would take to reach a level of population immunity?
Well, actually, if you look at what's happening here, I'm not actually doing any kind of herd immunity calculation. There's no 1 minus 1 over R here. It's just, if you wanted to end up with half the population immune, what would happen? And so that's that first row. And that's the sort of numbers that would have been looked at in exercise Nimbus. It's not exactly those ones, but it would have been something like that. And I mean, you just get to these numbers that clearly no one's going to tolerate. No one is going to tolerate 2,000 deaths each week. So a sense that, I guess what I'm saying at this stage is, I mean, what Chris said two days ago, nobody was ever considering this. But I guess I was getting up to speed with this was not something that could be considered.
Indeed. And then you send this document the same day to Professor Medley.
Yes, because I didn't want to be, remember I'm not on SPI-M at this stage, so I didn't want to be treading on his toes, just making sure he sees it.
Indeed. Now, just going back to the NHS data point that we discussed earlier, would you have expected better quality data at this stage to inform these sorts of calculations in terms of ICU capacity, bed space?
Yes, I think it would have been very useful if in one of the SAGE, as I say at the beginning, there's a discussion that I missed at SAGE if it has occurred. So I mean, I think that's a sort of polite way of saying, why on earth have we not had a discussion in which we look at some of these potential waves we're thinking about and plot them against our known capacity?
Indeed.
I think those, I mean, from other things I've seen you look at, perhaps those conversations were happening somewhere else.
If I can just pick up on one further point before leaving the document, you also raise nosocomial infections, so infections which take place when an individual is admitted to hospital. And certainly that was also a concern of yours at this stage, is that fair to say?
Yes.
We then move through the pandemic in terms of announcements on the 16th of March, just so that you're aware. That's when the Prime Minister says now is the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact and travel. And by the 18th of March, you, within SAGE, and indeed SPI-M as a consequence, had some data in respect to how people's behaviours had changed. Is that right?
That's right. This was data that we looked at SAGE on the 18th of March. And so this is 2 days after voluntary stay at home.
And what we see from that is that they'd achieved around a sort of 40% reduction in social contacts. But was that sufficient?
No, we knew that we needed about 75% reduction in contact. So I think this is something I think is quite important to remember, that we did actually have data that very day that said the voluntary reductions were not enough.
Indeed. And we see in fairness, we see quite significant voluntary behavioural change in reality. We see that 16% of those are school-aged children already stopped their children going to school. Yeah. We see the public reacting to that announcement.
Already.
But as you say, it simply was not enough in terms of what you considered was necessary to prevent the tsunami of potential infection.
Indeed.
But did you have enough data? You say you had some data, but I think I've heard other people say that it would take more than just 2 days to get sufficient data as to whether or not it was working. So what conclusions can we get after 2 days?
What conclusions we get after 2 days is that after 2 days we haven't got enough. I think there are other... I mean, that's all we had, and a decision had to be made. So I think there are other data streams that tell us that the voluntary measures weren't enough, and in particular, the fact that hospital admissions peaked on April the 2nd, and that's 10 days after March the 23rd. If the 16th of January had been enough, if the 16th of March had been enough to get R below 1, we would have expected hospital admissions to peak 10 days after that.
And that's your lagged point as well.
That's the 10-day lag.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And so broadly accurate, but insufficient.
I mean, I think all of us who were there. I mean, I have a photograph on my phone of an empty train as I went into London that week. It felt enormous. But actually, I think if we remember, it was not as enormous as the next week. I mean, the next week it was real sort of wind down an empty street, wasn't it?
Indeed, and that's when, of course, lockdown was announced.
Yes.
Now, with respect to the announcement of lockdown, in terms of its timeliness, what is your view on that?
You've already heard from colleagues that it was too late. So if we're doing a with benefit of hindsight exercise here, I would say it should have been 2 weeks earlier. That would have made a really huge difference. Now, we didn't have the data 2 weeks earlier, so by the 16th we had enough data. In my opinion, we should have gone into lockdown on that Monday, the 16th.
That's the critical period from your perspective, the 16th. The 16th is that critical timing in terms of the data sets that you had at the time and the knowledge base that you had at the time.
I think on the 16th, given what we knew about how fast this epidemic was spreading, given what we knew and could surmise about the fact that there seemed that probably everybody could catch it, I mean, probably everybody was susceptible to catch it, I think there was enough information on that date to say we need to stop all non-essential contact.
My lady, I'm going to turn to another topic. It's slightly earlier than would ordinarily be the break, but it may be that now is an appropriate moment.
Thank you. I shall return at 10 to 11.
All right. My lady. Professor, if I may just pick up very briefly on lockdown. We've just got to the point of the first lockdown and the stay-at-home guidance, and you're expressing your views on the timeliness of that lockdown. Can I just be clear, is that from a public health perspective?
Yes. I'm not entirely sure it's sensible to completely separate out the public health perspective and all the other costs. I think actually you had strong evidence from my colleague Tom Hale in Oxford that the countries that did best were countries that kept incidence low, and they had both better health outcomes and better economic outcomes. So the idea that it was this pure trade-off, one thing or the other, I think I don't think is a helpful mindset.
Indeed. But of course, when considering lockdown, there are other factors and there are the broader considerations alongside the public health considerations, as you've identified, economics, which may go one way or the other.
Yes.
Indeed. And then just dealing with your point about lagged delays. So we have the announcement of lockdown on the 23rd of March and stay at home. And we see, and you set it out within your witness statement, that again, peak hospital admissions then subsequently fell 10 days later on the 2nd of April.
Yes.
And what does that mean in terms of the R number from your perspective?
From my perspective, that tells us that the R number fell below 1 for the first time about 10 days earlier, namely on the 23rd of March.
And so we're seeing those correlations. You've given 2 examples now in your evidence so far. In terms of support for that view, what you also set out is the alternative if the R number had been higher during that second half of March. What implications would that have had in relation to the first wave?
Well, let's suppose there are various possibilities. If it had been higher and above 1, hospital admissions would have continued rising. I mean, that would have been intolerable. Everybody was very, very worried those days in early April. Was it going to peak? Would the stay-at-home law, so would the imposed lockdown be enough to bring R below 1? So that was the first thing. So that's a terrible outcome, would have been if hospital admissions had carried on rising. But even if it had fallen a little bit below 1, say, we think now it fell to about 0.7. If it had fallen but not that much, that first wave would have been bigger. It would have. So we'd have had a peak, but it wouldn't have come down so fast. I think most people feel that the first wave was bad enough.
I suspect that's a view that's broadly shared and uncontroversial. If I can then talk and ask you questions then about your involvement in the exit from lockdown. And you've already touched upon one aspect of that by reference to your colleague, Professor Thomas Hale, in relation to low incidence and the role that may have played in relation to pandemic response and outcomes. Now, in April, on the 10th of April, you attended a working group on the science of exit from lockdown. And at that meeting, that working group, there were two scenarios that were being discussed, weren't there? A low incidence scenario and a high incidence scenario. Can you just explain for us in simple terms what a low incidence scenario is? And then we'll move in a moment to the high incidence.
So I think a good way of labelling those, we ended up labelling them hospitals empty or hospitals full. So high incidence actually wasn't all that full. And the question, actually what we wanted to do was start to have strategic think through about what are we going to do. You know, we are in a deep hole here. We've got a nasty infectious disease circulating that is makes many people very ill and sadly kills quite a lot too. And most of our population is susceptible to it. And we don't know when we might have either drugs that are so great that we can treat infections really well, or a vaccine. So we don't know how long this is going to go on for. Let's start to have a think through what we can do about it. And so in some ways, I would say the low incidence and the high incidence comparison that we ended up making was an attempt to start a conversation, both with policymakers and decision takers, along the lines of, well, what is your strategy? What's the plan?
Indeed, and a lack of strategy or clear plan or strategic aim is one of the primary themes that's contained within your witness statement.
Yes.
If I can deal with that briefly with you now, you explain that the primary strategy that evolved, or the closest thing you got to, was the focus on the R number.
That's right.
And what impact did that have in terms of strategic thinking and your ability within SAGE and indeed SPI-M to model interventions and to provide policy, effectively options that could be developed to policy?
So I think if we were to be very straightforward, we could say the ends were, you will not collapse the NHS. So that was the strategic aim. The ways were, well, we'll control mixing so the R number is slightly less than 1. And my feeling was that was only really half of an explanation of what we were trying to do, because R round about 1 just means that the number of infections each day is flat. So you can have R round about 1 with hardly any infections each day, or R round about 1 with lots and lots of infections each day. So it didn't express an opinion about what those in power thought was the right way to work our way through this very difficult situation, I felt.
For example, by otherwise considering other targets such as the number of infections each day, or even, as unpalatable as it sounds, the maximum tolerable limit in terms of deaths.
Yes, or we could perhaps have had, I think it would have been useful if we had an expression from the NHS of how many people could they manage in hospital at any one time with COVID, whilst also doing all the other things that we need the NHS to do. But there was no appetite ever to express with such clarity what the plan was.
And the consequence of that is that there's no target that's breached, potentially.
That's right.
And effectively a trigger, or for use of a shorthand, to trigger other interventions or to bring in further aspects of a plan.
There were some levels, weren't there? There were those 5 levels I expect other people have talked to you about, but I don't think we ever had from central government, we want R slightly less than 1 and the number of new infections per day less than, let's say, some thousands of numbers.
And did you request further guidance or a clear strategic aim?
I certainly requested them of my civil service contacts. And I mean, they got to a stage where they knew what I was going to say, you know, because the plans would come back that it was, you know, sort of a tolerable number or something, and they knew I was going to say, well, what's a tolerable number? What number is that? But I mean, I think it's very clear that that was a choice, not to articulate a number on what was tolerable.
Indeed. And so that in itself is a positive decision.
Indeed.
Then the consequence from your perspective, and I appreciate this is from a public health or science advisory perspective that I'm asking you to speak about here, was that it was very difficult was it very difficult to therefore model and plan and provide a route through?
So if you're not told what's the objective, it becomes very difficult to say, watch out, you're 3 weeks from breaching your objective, say. So we always had to impose an objective of our own. So somewhere else in these documents, you'll see a document where we say, well, you're a few weeks from having more admissions every day than you had in the peak of the first wave. That wasn't because somebody else had said, please do that calculation. It was because we felt decision takers needed to see that calculation because things were getting so bad.
Indeed. And so with a clearer goal or level or strategic aim in mind, would it have been possible, looking back, to have managed the pandemic more effectively?
Well, looking back, let us imagine that in September 2020, we had breached some then specified level. Actually, we did. We breached the reasonable worst case scenario, which had been specified by COVID-S, not by us. You could imagine a world where we had said, well, where decision takers had said, oh gosh, we've breached the target, let's get a grip. And that is not what happened.
We're going to move to that in due course, but coming back then to the 10th of April and this working group, this was an effort in terms of low and high incidence, running a pandemic, also you to put it in hot or cold terms, to engage or get decision makers and policy makers to engage with what it was that they saw as a clear strategy.
Yes, and the point of that document was to lay out how different things would be with respect to a whole lot of different factors. For example, contact tracing is only really going to be able to make a huge difference if you're running a cold epidemic, if you've got low incidence, because once incidence is really high, it becomes very difficult to do contact tracing well enough to find everybody who's got infected and get them into isolation. So there's quite a long table in that document of sort of careful thinking about what would be the difference between these two. I mean, if I may, there is, I think, really the closing paragraph of that document finished the question for us, in which somebody makes the point, or the point is made, well, let's just imagine that low incidence is about 1/5 of high incidence. That means we're accruing immunity 5 times more slowly. That means if we think roughly speaking, and we did think roughly speaking, we get to a useful amount of immunity in 1 year with high incidence.
With high incidence.
With high incidence. That means if we think we might get a vaccine or a really good pharmaceutical, a really good drug, in anything less than 5 years, then we should go for low. And that was sort of the killer for us. That was the end of the question for us. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just go back to the point about not having a plan? Yep. I appreciate having a plan or a strategy would make your life and the life of your colleagues a great deal easier to provide what you consider to be more accurate and sensible advice. But provided the experts advising decision makers were getting the message across that this was going to be a nightmare, the NHS would be overwhelmed, do you have to have a target that gets breached?
No. We don't. I mean, we might come to that at the end because there was never any target expressed in the 2021 spring documents. There's no numerical target. I would say it's probably more to do with politics and values and acting fast. I mean, I think the fact that fast action was required, I think that is a scientific issue because it's to do with the system science it's basically to do with the fact that you've got fast exponential growth and fast exponential growth and lag delays. Those are scientific issues. I think articulated targets might have driven faster action. And in that case would have been good from the point of view of pandemic control.
Thank you.
And we'll touch upon that as we come into the autumn period in due course. And then indeed we will turn to the roadmap and the targets and objectives that were outlined there and the policy objectives. But perhaps just to round off this, if I can just bring up INQ 212100. This is an email from you It's the one that attaches your paper that we've just been discussing, but you boil it down to Sir Patrick Vallance within this email. If I can just go down slightly further, into a very simple dichotomy in many respects for politicians, so decision makers. Do you want to keep COVID deaths as low as possible until pharmaceuticals provide a solution? That's your vaccine or your medicine. Or are you prepared to define a tolerable level of COVID deaths that would allow us to start moving towards an immune population while we wait? And of course, as you say, the devil then is how small can tolerable be, and still move towards an immune population at some meaningful rate. And then you explain further, as you've just touched upon, if you want to be at population immunity within a year, we cannot imagine getting there with any fewer than N deaths as a simple way of explaining to those decision makers what the consequences of either hot or cold, low or high incidence would be. Now, in terms of SAGE and your colleagues, the general consensus was that the low incidence approach was the preferable one, and that was communicated upwards.
I assume so. Yes, I think so. So I'm pretty sure that what happened is that Chris and Patrick wrote their own version of this document, which they, I assume, then took to Cabinet.
And we touched upon that already in terms of some of the evidence that we've heard. Now, just if I may now turn to another aspect, that alongside all of this, while you're running through those scenarios, you're also considering the possibility, at least, of elimination.
Discussing, yeah.
Indeed. And you raised that on the 18th of April and indeed on the 19th of April. Firstly, in an email to Professor Medley on the 18th, and then secondly, in a conversation with Professor Sir Patrick Vallance. Mm-hmm. And in respect of that, you're essentially saying, have we properly considered it? Have we ruled this out as a potential option? You also address within that the potential for the health and social care infections to be driving the community epidemic, as opposed to the other way around, with the community epidemic driving the health and social care infections. We've not seen any further material in relation to pursuing elimination as a strategy, but what were your views at that time, and was it a possible strategy to be pursued?
So quite quickly, because the infection was so widely seeded across the population, and as we were finding out more about asymptomatic infections, it was very clear that it was not feasible. At that point, we probably had a discussion in which we said, well, we could do a bunch of calculations, we could make a model, we could, do some squiggly Greek letters, but at the end of the day, we're just going to say exactly those words. So this was a place where doing some modelling simply doesn't add anything, so let's not do it. So that was elimination. I think I did feel then, let's challenge that a bit, let's make absolutely clear, because Australia and New Zealand were aiming for elimination. But so let's be clear in our heads why we think it's not going to be possible. And for people like us, the way to be clear in your heads is to think it through with a little model. But it clearly wasn't a useful way to spend a lot of time for SPI-M. Were the hospital and care home epidemics driving the... Did we need basically a three-part model? So a model that had the community and care homes and hospitals. I think we probably put that to modellers and they said, no, we don't think so. One of the big models did end up with care homes in it. But fundamentally, I think we ended up with the decision that, no, they weren't driving. They were important in terms of places where large numbers of very vulnerable people gathered together, but they weren't important in terms of driving transmission back into the wider population.
Just touching, if I may, on elimination more generally, this is obviously in April, but looking back now, would elimination have ever been possible on what is known?
Certainly not after we'd seeded the epidemic the way we did after half-term in February.
Thank you. Now, as we emerged from lockdown 1 and moving then into the summer months of then May 2020, you took part in, well, over the course of the pandemic, a number of Number 10 Downing Street press conferences. In May 2020, in reference to coming out of lockdown and any changes in relation to lockdown, you explained that the scientific evidence was clear, and that any changes to lockdown were also dependent on the track and trace system being in place. Now, that was obviously your comments then in May 2020. Was that track and trace system ever in place to an adequate level to enable that to actually take place?
I think our estimates in the summer of 2020 was that it was probably blocking about 1 in 5, so 20% of onward infections, and that in order to have so substantial an impact that big changes could be made to how much mixing we could have without driving R above 1, that needed to be more like 4 out of 5.
Thank you. And then further in that press conference, you also said that any lifting of restrictions should be based on observed levels of infection and not on fixed dates.
Yeah.
So effectively data, not dates, as in shorthand. Was that observed at that period in the pandemic?
Gosh. I do not remember exactly what happened with the unlocking of the lockdown through the summer of 2020. I'm sorry, I can't exactly remember.
Not at all.
Numbers were low then.
Thank you. And in terms of any feedback loop that you had, what did you consider the main drivers within government to have been in relation to exit strategies from lockdown and more generally the loosening of restrictions?
There were very, very clear indications that quite reasonably recovery of economic activity was a very strong driver. We can remember now that getting children back to school for sure for September was a very strong driver. And I can remember debate that if we wanted children back at school, and clearly we did, we might well have to put a lot of restrictions on other kinds of activities, especially given that contact tracing was not ramping up as fast as we had hoped.
Indeed. Now, if I may take you, please, to paragraph 120 of your statement at page 36. And this is dealing with the position coming out of that first initial lockdown, and indeed in April of 2020 through to May. You explain there that it's about halfway down. I do not know what people in government understood the characteristics of Covid-19 to be, but we were worried that for whatever reasons, decision makers had not taken on board quite how serious it was. You explain then by reference to an early meeting that you had in the Ministry of Defence, where your comment that it would take at least 18 months was met with disbelief. Was that a view that you saw more widely across government?
I think if we'd been in the room together, of course it was all a Zoom meeting then, I'd have used the phrase you could have heard a pin drop. Perhaps disbelief is a little bit hard, but I mean, it was quite shocking, wasn't it? I think for all of us, the thought that that was quite a hard idea to get your head round, was that we were in so much trouble that it might take us more than a year to get out of that trouble. And as I say, there were midway reviews in April, which we were certainly not midway in April, were we? I think in retrospect, one of the things that I wish we had done, that's sort of what I think of as the missing commission. So in that summer of 2020, when things were under control, I really wish there'd been a cross-government commission that recognised all this, that said, well, we're in this for the long term. It's going to take until we get a vaccine and then another year. So what are we going to do? There aren't really good options. Are there any less worse options? And I would have, in retrospect, I think we should have used the expertise that we had both inside government and had already gathered from outside government to pause and think really carefully about a long-term plan.
Thank you. And would you describe that as a missed opportunity?
I do think that was a missed opportunity. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, I didn't ever ask for it at the time.
Indeed. Well, that's what I was going. That's the next. Indeed, you've already foreseen where was my next question. But perhaps then, therefore, going to the summer of 2020, and you've explained that infections were low. I think the R rate was something that was around 0.7 or so at that stage in the summer. We then move into the June, July, August period, and of course in July the Eat Out to Help Out policy was announced. We know that SAGE were not consulted on that policy, is that right?
That is right.
Was SPI-M consulted?
We were not consulted.
And indeed, you've been through this, both the SAGE and the SPI-M consensus statements, and there's no references to it there.
Correct.
Do you have any knowledge at all about what, if any, scientific advice informed that scheme?
No, I don't know anything about any scientific advice that went into that.
And in terms of your view on that scheme and what the advice that you would have given at the time, what would that have been?
It would have been along the lines of advice that we were giving routinely, which is that there wasn't much room for increasing mixing, and that the kind of mixing that should be avoided is between households indoors. So we would have said, could you not find some other way to stimulate the economy?
And if I can just call up, please, a SPI-M paper which deals with social distancing measures. It's dated the 22nd of June of 2020. It's 74930 and it's page 1. If I can just go to paragraph 4. Here, what we see within SPI-M is effectively it's looking at how one goes forward and takes MPIs forwards and relaxation. And what's set out here is that rather than focusing on reintroduction or relaxation of individual measures in isolation, it's necessary to consider a package of interventions as a whole and what implications one measure may have for choices in another. It's trade-offs, in short. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And you explain you could use the ready reckoners that we've already discussed and touched upon to explore the impact of transmission from one intervention to be weighted against other potential relaxations. None of that work, as far as you are aware, was conducted in relation to the Eat Out from Help Out scheme by SPI-M or SAGE.
Certainly not by SPI-M or SAGE. I don't know if by other people.
And then if we go to paragraph 5, you explain here that this is SPI-M's view.
Yeah.
So the committee do not believe it is possible to return to a pre-COVID normality without levels of contact tracing and COVID security effectiveness that would be difficult to achieve without some additional increase in immunity or vaccines and so on. And just to be clear, COVID security, effectively MPIs.
COVID security is more things like everybody washing their hands very carefully, maybe wearing masks. Do you remember there were all those screens that went everywhere, restrictions on how many people were in a room? So it was more those sorts of MPIs, yes.
And if we continue on page 5, paragraph 5, sorry, it states in order to be able to reopen schools in September without causing a second wave, it is therefore critical that some measures remain in place so that the reproduction number, R, remains below 1 at the start of September when they all return to school.
Yes.
And that's the position in June. Would that have still been the position in July?
And August.
And August.
And September.
Indeed. Now, at that point of the advice in June and through July, the R number was 0.7 to 0.9. It began increasing in August. And indeed, upon school return in September, it was between 0.9 and 1.1, and then increased to an R rate of 1 to 1.2 by the 11th of September, and then we saw an increase upwards. So in respect of that second wave, was that second wave foreseeable?
Yes, that second wave was foreseeable. I mean, but because for the simple reason that virtually nobody had it. And
indeed, winter was also coming.
Yes.
And we've heard from Professor Sir Chris Whitty that history has taught us that in pandemics, second winter waves often far exceed the first wave.
They do indeed. And actually, I think most parents know that September is a time of year when respiratory infections are often rife.
Indeed. September to December is just constant germ after germ.
Yep.
So if I can then move then into the September period, so schools are returning. And if I can just take you, please, to paragraph 153 of your statement. It's on page 47. You describe this quite acutely as the worst moment of the pandemic. And why do you say that? Why do you describe it in those terms?
It was very frustrating for us to have been asked to advise the government and to advise the government that the autumn would be difficult and that difficulty would manifest as rising numbers of infections. And then we had this astonishingly good ability to watch that happening with the ONS COVID infection study, and it just proceeded to happen. So we said, you should do something now, but nothing happened.
Do you recall the earliest point at which you said you should do something?
Let's have a think. We had made in the summer, we had made the new reasonable worst case. So that was the one that sort of ran from, I should think, about August into late autumn. And in the reasonable worst case, which, as I say, was based on actions specified by COVID-S, cases start to tick up in early September, as we would always have expected to have done. And I can't remember where the words came from, but in the reasonable worst case, somebody gets a grip. So actually what happens is that cases are then flat through September. So it would have been in our minds all along that if we wanted this time to keep infections flat whilst they were still low, so not get ourselves into a panicky situation where it's all running away from us, this was when we needed to do it. And that, this idea that the interventions that keep an epidemic flat are not as bad, not as damaging as the ones that you have to impose if you've got to get cases down really fast. So that was the time to act, we felt, and we kept saying so. And I suppose we couldn't understand why weren't we explaining clearly enough that this was what we needed to do.
Indeed. And if I could just call up the SAGE minutes from the 17th of September of 2020, it's 61565. It's paragraph 3 on page 2.
Yeah.
What we see here is advice in relation to a circuit breaker. And it explains where more stringent restrictions are put in place for a shorter period could have a significant impact on transmission. So modelling indicates a 2-week period of restrictions similar to those enforced in late May could delay the epidemic by approximately 4 weeks.
Yes.
And so was a circuit breaker the advice that was being given at that point?
Yes, that was the SAGE advice. So a circuit breaker is an intense intervention where what you do is you bring cases down, say for a fortnight, and then you let go again.
So something short of effectively a full lockdown, or if you were looking at it in a slightly different way and using your earlier terminology, an intermittent lockdown of a shorter period.
Yes.
What's the point of doing that if it's just going to come back if you don't know when you're going to have a vaccine?
That eventually you're going to have to do something. So that keeping infections low, maybe with intermittent lockdowns. So you do circuit breakers for 2 weeks, you go back to normal life for 4 weeks. That's not as damaging as what Tom Hale described as the roller coaster, where you let infections grow until you're just about to break the NHS, and then you bring in a massive, massive lockdown. So it's a way of keeping infections low whilst not being in lockdown all the time.
Why aren't intermittent lockdowns a roller coaster?
Because it's a very little boring roller coaster. You're just going like this. For example, your contact tracing works better because you've never got very high incidence. Also, your hospitals work better because they're not completely full. One of the things that we saw was that fatality rates in hospital were higher when the hospitals were fuller. There were plenty of good reasons why intermittent, short lockdowns could well have been better than the long, harsh lockdowns that we had to live because we put them off to the last possible moment.
And that's pulling it back to the low incidence rate as opposed to the high incidence rate, running an epidemic hot or cold, trying to keep a lower level of infections, albeit they go up and down and rise up and down. They don't meet that peak effectively.
That's right.
Now, you were subsequently invited to a meeting with the Prime Minister on the 20th of September of 2020. But I just want to deal with something very shortly before that and prior to the meeting on the 18th of September. And some messages with Sir Patrick Vallance. It's on INQ 229601. And it's the bit at the bottom that I'm interested in. It says, I have an invite to a Zoom with the Prime Minister at 5:30 on Sunday. Be honoured to accept that invitation. However, I assume this is the meeting you and Stu were organising yesterday. presumably a reference to Stuart Wainwright at Go Science. Does it fit your plan if I rock up and say RWCS, reasonable worst case scenario, assumes someone gets a grip at this stage of things and it would be great if it happened? And can you explain in your own words what you were trying to impress upon, certainly Sir Patrick at that point, and your view?
I'm quite a believer in the single voice of consensus science. So what I was checking here was basically running past Patrick what I'm planning to say so that he knows in advance of the meeting. And reasonable worst case scenario assumes someone gets a grip at this stage. We just talked about that. We were all invited to write a single page explanation of I think the title of the meeting was something like, should the government act now?
Indeed, I'm going to move to that in just a moment, and we'll discuss the meeting and what views were put across within that meeting, and indeed your view at that point. And then what we see here, just to round this off so we can take it away, from Sir Patrick Vallance back, is this is a meeting where the Prime Minister wants to hear from a range of scientists, specifically the Hennigan and Gupta let it rip variety. We have got a rather balanced group to make sure he hears all sides. Message re-getting a grip. Yes, please. And indeed, I'm going to maybe just deal with that now. Do you consider that you got across that message within that meeting?
I said those words. I don't know. I mean, nothing happened, so inadequately at best.
And if I can turn to that meeting now, and just speaking with one voice. So Sir Patrick Vallance was on the same page as you. Is that fair to say at that point?
I think so. Yes.
Sage and SPI-M.
Yes.
So all unanimous going into that meeting in terms of that perspective. Now, if I can just call up the meeting, please. Thank you. This is the COVID-19 small group scientific discussion. That was the formal name given to it. We see that indeed you're right about the question, the essay question as it may have been posed, or exam question. Should government intervene now, and if so? And we see a list there of attendees. We have some names redacted, but the reality is it's all in the public domain in any event. And indeed, we have a statement. The first of those is Professor Gupta, and the second of those is Anders Tegnell, Chief Scientist in Sweden. But we see the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Secretary who's chairing it, Sir Patrick Vallance, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, Professor John Edmonds, and we'll move to him in a moment, Professor Carl Hennigan, who we've also heard from, and then you. And for the purposes of this meeting, as you've just explained, you were asked to set out your views in a one-page document, a very short document. And if I can just deal with the position in relation to the varying views around the table or on Zoom, online at that time, but just deal with points of similarity. Was it the case that at any point anyone in that meeting was expressing a view that the government ought not to do anything at that time?
My memory is that there were some people who felt more studies were necessary, which was pretty close to nothing in my view.
Indeed. And then we have Anders Tegnell. I'll just pull up his document for one moment. That's INQ. I think we're on the right one, but page 11, please. Chief Scientist in Sweden. He set out a short note as requested for the benefit of the meeting. He explains in the second paragraph down that his answer to the question, should government intervene now and if so, in my opinion, yes. The myth that Sweden did nothing during the pandemic is false. He talks about a wide range of activities that were initiated there. Speaks about the public health community. He continues to go down and says, I believe that there is a strong consensus that with a pandemic, a government needs to be active, even if we know that most of the non-medical measures have comparatively little effect, and the evidence for how and when they work is limited. But even so, there is a possibility to make a difference. That's Professor Tegnell's view. If I can now take it to your view, and that's at page 13 of this document. Oh, I don't know if we can rotate it. Is this the paper that you prepared?
Yes.
And we've heard reference already to the reasonable worst case scenario.
Yes.
And you explain that's a COVID S.
That's right. So that little picture at the top left was given to SPI-M by Covid-19 saying, do something a bit like the red line here. So a difficult autumn followed by a large winter peak. So that red arrow, I think that I've put on there, says this is roughly where we are towards the end of September. Things are okay in July. They've been getting a bit worse. There it is with the COVID. So you can see the dotted red line being flat for a while through October. So that wasn't going to happen without some substantial intervention.
And so this is your, as you say, the reasonable worst case scenario. You then set out a position with interventions. At the bottom of that page, to the left, you explain that both scenarios assume decisive action is taken now.
Yes.
It says, and it expands a little bit, assume decisive action in mid-September brings the R back to 1 so that new infections remain flat for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
You then go on to set out in the middle how the numbers compare today. Can you just run us through that very briefly?
Very good. So this is sort of the second bit of the argument. Where are we? The reasonable worst case scenario says, roughly speaking, prevalence is how many people out there are infected. Reasonable worst case scenario thinks about 78,000. Now it happened to be 71,000. The fact that these are pretty close in agreement is kind of irrelevant. The point is that we had made this plan, the first column, that things would get a little bit worse in September and then we'd do something about it. And this is me saying that has happened. Things have got a bit worse. They're about where we were afraid they would be. And they're getting worse. I think the point I was trying to make with these numbers was you are about to exceed your own reasonable worst case scenario. And that means all the plans that you have made are going to fail because they were made against the reasonable worst case scenario. If it has any purpose, the purpose of a reasonable worst case scenario is that it lets government make plans in which and assume that, on the assumption that the situation here, the disease, the level of infection, won't be so bad as to break those plans. So we're about to break, things are getting so bad that they're worse than the RWCS. When you specified what you were going to do, you said you'd do something now.
So this was an internal target effectively set by Covid-19.
Up to a point, except that there's no numbers on the y-axis in the Covid-19 graph.
And you set out below it a short graph which effectively illustrates the fact that hospital admissions are really following the first wave pattern in terms of regions.
Yes.
And so those that were most badly hit in the first wave are also being most badly hit in the second wave. And then finally, in part 3 of your paper, you explain, well, what happens next? Where does this end up, the trajectory? Yeah. And what you explain here is that under the current trajectory, hospitalisations will increase exponentially, surpassing the first wave by early November.
That's right.
And then you go on to explain about the governmental planning. You explain about epidemiology is in line with the reasonable worst case scenario, but infections are still rising. And you explain that you expect that reasonable worst case scenario to be breached
in days.
And
I think that closing sentence is worth noticing. Test and trace will not function effectively in a large second wave.
And of course, that's one of the tools in the pandemic toolbox.
Yeah.
Now, Professors Gupta and Professors Hennigan put forward an alternative view within that meeting. A large part of that was effectively advanced on segmentation or protecting and isolating vulnerable groups, and establishing a degree of herd immunity. What were your views in relation to those alternative views?
I think our experience had already been that it was extremely difficult to protect vulnerable groups. That, first of all, it was practically very hard to put in enough protection so that infection never reached the known vulnerable. That's thing one. And secondly, there were lots of people who ended up very ill, either with acute COVID or with long COVID, who were not amongst the known vulnerable. So I didn't think it was a practical approach at all.
Ms. Cecil, I don't know if you're going to come to it, but you've referred us to the Swedish experts' views on the screen and Professor McLean's views. Are Professor Gupta and Professor Hennigan's views going to be displayed, or are they not in this document?
They are in this document. I wasn't going to take them to them in relation to Professor Hennigan because he's explained his views earlier in the evidence, but I certainly can. If I can just pull it back, they're in the pages that precede this one. I believe they're on pages 10 and 11 from recollection, I'm afraid. If I can just go to those, but we can certainly have a look at them. And back one further page in that case. Let's start on page 9. This is Professor Hennigan's views. And we see here that halfway down the first paragraph, he takes the view that recent responses are out of proportion to the threat, that they are underpinned by a lack of data, a lack of understanding, of the role of data, role of community pathogens, and an over-reliance on predictive modelling. And he very strongly bases that on the fact that it's effectively been influenza preparedness, and that has had a significant impact upon the advice that's been provided, and effectively that advice is wrong. What are your views in relation to that?
I think that we were expecting a large autumn wave and that something needed to be done to prevent it. Sadly, that large autumn wave did happen. I don't really think that's to do with was this influenza or was it a different respiratory infection. It was a respiratory infection to which there was very, very little immunity in the population at that time. Because dreadful though the first wave felt, it actually infected rather a small proportion of the population.
If we can just look a little bit further down this page, please. I touched upon it earlier in relation to the control strategies that they were in. Collectively, there are differences between their papers, but one aspect of it was about those targeted measures and segmentation. And there has been a criticism levelled that segmentation was never considered properly by SPI-M or SAGE. What do you have to say about that?
It was quite carefully considered. Segmentation can be used in several different ways. One way of thinking about it would be simply on age. Should we have let the over 40s the under 40s or the under 45s live a normal life whilst everybody else was in lockdown? I would say it was very clear. You don't need modelling. You can just look at the data that we have about household composition, so what age of people live with other people, or we have beautiful data about who mixes with whom. I talked a bit about that with the BBC data. It was very, very clear that there was far too much mixing between different age groups for that sort of segmentation plan to work, because even a little bit of leakage from if you had half your population leading a normal life back into the segmented is enough to be very, very damaging at this point in time when immunity in the population was so very low. So that's age segmentation. Then other ideas about protecting the vulnerable by making sure the people who come into contact with them are doing, say, lots of testing. Always seemed to me intuitively appealing, but probably needed to work in a context of very low infection in the community, because they weren't going to be perfect. So if they would work best if there was not much infection in the wider community. And of course, there are the points that have been made to you earlier this week by Professor Whitty and Professor Vallance, that those put a huge, huge burden on more vulnerable people.
Now, just dealing, if I may, then with segmentation, and indeed, there's various different ways of referring to it. We've heard about shielding, we've heard about super shielding, and we've heard some evidence on cocooning as well. But in terms of SAGE, SAGE had indeed sought earlier advice and notes on segmentation, all the way back in the summer, effectively, of June, July, and indeed shielding conversations had taken place much, much earlier than that.
Yes.
Thank you. One aspect that you may have found some level of agreement with Professor Hennigan in relation to is that relation to care homes that he flags.
Yep.
There's an aspect in relation to nosocomial infections. He's advancing something that is effectively a much less restrictive set of MPIs with 50% work at home strategy on young people to simplify messaging, and then also in his view, seeking to increase the personal threat perception should also be reconsidered. Alongside a couple of others, was considered to be sufficient. In your view, as at the 20th of September 2020, would those measures have been adequate or sufficient to have prevented the second wave?
I think not. Particularly, I mean, if you look what's happening here, the only community-level intervention here is 50% work-at-home strategy. If you think about those pictures I showed you earlier of Ready Reckoners, 50% wouldn't be enough. We hadn't acquired a whole lot of new immunity between May and September that would have made our situation better, and contact tracing was revving up, but was more like 20% efficacy than anything higher.
Thank you. And then if I can just take you, please, to Professor Gupta. And she is a professor of theoretical epidemiology at Oxford University.
Same department you've been in.
Indeed, at the Department of Zoology. She's been a fairly high-profile critic of the approach undertaken by, indeed, SAGE, SPI-M and the government during the pandemic. In summary, what her views as espoused within this document are that restrictive measures that have been imposed have been outweighed by the costs, particularly for those poorest or most vulnerable, firstly. That's a broader issue rather than simply the epidemiological position or the public health position, because obviously that's looking at socioeconomic considerations and other considerations, but also refers to herd immunity. I can just, and it's at page 8 of the document, please. And the starting premise here, in terms of the key issue from her perspective, in terms of her note, was whether or not it's justified to take extraordinary measures in response to Covid-19, given that no extraordinary measures are in place for other infectious diseases such as influenza, pneumococcal pneumonia, or other coronaviruses. And that's because we've reached an accommodation with those, and we accept that they cause a level of disease, suffering and death, but not sufficient to change our way of life. She accepts it's not possible or realistic to attempt to eliminate Covid-19, but that the goal should be to achieve levels of herd immunity. She then goes on to speak about herd immunity not being a policy, and gives a little bit more of a description there. What is your view in relation to that?
I think these issues about I think it says here, we can't tell, we don't know how close we are to the herd immunity threshold. I would disagree with that statement. I think we could tell from quite straightforward antibody tests that were available at that time that could be applied in closed populations with big outbreaks, where we could see how extensive an epidemic would be before it naturally came to an end. That we did have reasonable measures of how close we were to herd immunity, and that we were a very long way from it and could therefore expect a large autumn wave, which indeed did then happen.
And at the very end of her document, she posits 2 scenarios, ultimately. The first is to bring in population-wide restrictions to keep infection levels down until the vaccine becomes available. The downside to that, for her, is that it comes at huge social and economic cost. Not clear that such a policy is sustainable until that development of that vaccine. And the second solution, which is, and I'm assuming it's the one that was posited within the meeting, is to take steps to protect the vulnerable while allowing those that are at low risk to accumulate immunity. So it's going back to that herd immunity point that you've already addressed, such that the risk to the former is reduced as rapidly as possible to levels that are acceptable for other respiratory pathogens.
Yeah.
And she speaks about the very low death rates of Covid-19 in much of the population, while permitting and supporting the rest to adopt social distancing measures commensurate with their risk. And in fairness, Professor, I think you've already dealt with those issues, because really it's talking about, again, segmentation or cocooning or shielding in some way, and then herd immunity. So in terms of the meeting and how it, or the group and how it progressed, were each of you given an opportunity to present your papers and present your views?
That's right, that's how it went.
And
Looking at your paper, Professor, I heard the expression this week that the advice had to be electrifying. She wanted to trigger the action. Could I confess that I don't find your paper electrifying?
Yeah, but you don't like graphs. No, I agree.
But your audience may not have liked graphs.
No, well, that's a
either.
very good point. I think it's better than all this text, myself. I think you raise a really important issue, which is how a scientific advisor is going to get a whole lot better at communicating what we think. Because I agree with you, I thought that was a pretty electrifying page, and it's very interesting for me to hear that you don't find it electrifying. And I ran the experiment, and they didn't do what we said, did they? So for me, pictures are better than text. I think you're right. One has to remember that there are many people that might be a cultural thing, and there might be there are lots of people for whom text is better than pictures.
Indeed, in your witness statement, just picking up on that point, one of the lessons to be learned as you identify it is that science advisors, SAGE, whoever it may be, need to be more unequivocal in their advice, more forceful, effectively, in their advice.
Yes.
Is that right? What you say in that is that as advisors, you should have thought more critically about the state of mind of those you're advising, and this is in the context of delay, the reasons for that delay, not least because you needed to assume that elected officials do not want to make unpopular decisions, extremely difficult for them to do so.
Yes.
And you're talking here about lockdown, but if we'd had a better sense of how unpalatable lockdown was to decision makers, if anything, this would have expedited strong advice to lockdown rather than give us cause to delay providing the advice or to weaken its terms. And you make it very plain that looking to the future, advisors should err on the side of giving unequivocal advice earlier in the context of advising on time-sensitive matters.
Yes.
Here specifically about the pandemic.
I agree, and clearly more electrifyingly.
Indeed.
Do apologise.
It's fine.
And in terms of how those views were expressed, obviously that's how they were expressed on paper. You already explained that you did say to those in the meeting, which of course included the Prime Minister and other senior members of the government, that they needed to somebody needed to get a grip.
Yeah.
How was that received?
In silence. I mean, they just sat there in silence and listened to us. I don't remember there being many questions, except towards the end, where I think somebody said, what do you think we should do? They just went round, the four of us, and said, five of us, sorry, what do you think we should do? There wasn't a lot of discussion, that's what I remember.
And when asked, what do you think we should do, what was your response?
So I actually gave my own personal response, which I realised perhaps I shouldn't have. But anyway, I said, I think we should go into lockdown with schools open.
And schools open.
Yeah. And I think that was an honest reflection that I didn't really think 2 weeks was going to be enough.
And in terms of the others in the meeting at that point, so Professor Gupta, do you recall what she said?
I don't recall.
No. Professor Hannigan?
I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Not at all. And you may not recall in relation to Professor Dr. Tegnell?
No.
Tegnell? Or indeed...
John, I do remember, because John said we need to be in lockdown now, and it was unusual, and I remember thinking, oh, gosh, is he right and I'm wrong? Can we sort of afford, have we got enough? If we just need to keep incidents flat, can we manage that with schools open?
Indeed, if we can bring up. I've just realised we've not taken you to Professor John Edmonds' paper, but that's on page 7 of I137261. And we see that he sets out the current picture within the UK epidemiologically. In dealing with the herd immunity point, perhaps bullet point 4 is relevant. His view was that only around 7% of the population had been infected. Did that accord with your view?
Yes, that's right. No, we had epidemiology. So we knew that 7% of the population had antibodies. We also knew from a big outbreak that had happened on a fishing vessel that antibodies appeared after you'd been infected.
Okay. And it's explained here, yet around 50,000 have died. Letting an epidemic run in the remaining 93% would result in around 500,000 deaths. It explains that large incidents, including increase of incidents in care homes, epidemic is doubling every 7 to 8 days. It then deals with the need for a package of measures, lockdown and closure of all facilities, etc. And all of those in March combined reduced the R number to about 0.7. And indeed, that's what we were looking at, if you recall, earlier when we looked at what the R number was in the summer of June, when SAGE and SPI-M met. And so what he then says is, to meet Her Majesty's government's aim, as it was then, of keeping the R below 1, a large package of interventions will have to be implemented, not just 1 or 2. It talks about educational institutions. If they are to remain open, a very wide package of other interventions will be essential. And then what he deals about is the imperative for speed of action. Response needs to be fast and large. The harder the measures, the less time they need to be in place for.
Yep.
It then continues to explain that the UK responded slowly in March and paid a heavy price for this in terms of deaths. Shows unambiguously the key factor for the large number of deaths in the UK was the lateness of our response. We should not make the same mistake again. And it goes on, immediate action has an enormous impact when cases are increasing exponentially, which they now are. And then he sets out his graphs, small graphs, I'm afraid, which show the effect of an immediate circuit breaker. Any delay will result in far more cases. We see the dotted line on the figure 1B, and therefore hospitalisations and deaths. And then unequivocally he ends with no intervention would be disastrous. In terms of your views and Professor John Edmonds, did they align?
I think pretty much in the bit where he says if we want, well, I certainly agree that no interventions would be disastrous, that for sure. I think the bit where he says if we want to keep educational institutions open, we will have to have very substantial measures pretty much everywhere else. I think that was a different way of saying the same thing. Lockdown, schools open.
He speaks in here of not making the same mistake again in relation to delay.
Yes.
Did you consider that government was potentially making the same mistake again at that point in September?
I felt we were at that stage at risk of making the same mistake again. If we had acted decisively then, we would have learnt from March, but we didn't. Implication, we had not learnt from March.
We know that there was no circuit breaker in September at this stage.
No.
Was that, in your view, from your public health perspective and epidemiological perspective, a mistake?
Yes, I believe that was a mistake. I think if we'd had a circuit breaker in September, we could have kept cases would have dropped a little bit, and then we would have bought some time.
In the absence of a circuit breaker at that stage, again, what were the consequences from your perspective?
The number of infections kept rising through September and October, with attendant hospitalisations and, sadly, deaths.
Had there been a circuit breaker, therefore, again, in your view, would the number of deaths have been lower?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the remainder of that meeting, were any views expressed by the Prime Minister that you can recall?
I don't remember the Prime Minister saying anything.
The Cabinet Secretary?
No, I remember one person, but I don't remember who it was, asking this question about what should we, meaning they, the government, do, which we've just talked about.
Did either of Sir Patrick Vallance or Professor Chris Whitty express a view in the meeting?
I'm sorry, I can't remember.
And then we also understand that the Chancellor was present.
Well, I think perhaps he called in. I'm not certain. I'm sure he was there.
And did he make any contribution?
Well, you see, I think it was him who asked, what should we do? But perhaps that's just an incorrect memory.
Now, after that meeting, the following day, there was a further SAGE meeting on the 21st of September. And if I can just pull that up, it's 61566.
Yep.
Page 2, please. And it's paragraph 2. It starts by setting out that COVID-19 incidence is increasing across the country. It talks about the effect of schools, colleges and universities. Doubling time could currently be as short as 7 days. And then it goes on to make recommendations at this point. A package of interventions will need to be adopted to reverse this exponential rise in cases. And it then goes on to talk about single interventions, coming back to the single or package of interventions that we've discussed. Single interventions are, by themselves, are unlikely to be able to bring R below 1. And we see the confidence intervals, those, we've discussed those previously in evidence, high confidence in that assertion. The short list of MPIs that should be considered for an immediate introduction include, and that's where we see a circuit breaker, to return incidents to low levels, advice to work from home, banning all contact within the home with members of other households, closure of all retail, hospitality, and so on, and that university and college teaching moves to online. So at this point, these are recommendations with schools staying open.
Yep.
And so that's the recommendation at the 21st. We then see, on the 24th of September, a further SAGE meeting. And that's at 61567. If we can go to page 3, please, at paragraph 16. And if we look at paragraph 16, it talks about SAGE's previous advice, from the one that we've just seen, a 2-week circuit breaker where more stringent restrictions are put in place for a shorter period could have additional impact. A shorter break of a week or less is likely to be less effective in reducing the number of infections and slowing the growth of the epidemic. So at this stage, the advice is still consistent, circuit breaker.
Yep.
At any point, was there any alternative advice in September aside from we need to enter a circuit, I need to have a circuit breaker to deal with the rise in cases?
No.
So looking and turning to the issue about delay and delay in decision making, at this stage, no decision had been taken.
That's correct.
And that, as we've discussed, is a positive choice in itself with consequences.
Yes.
And and you've described a period of frustration. How are you feeling at this stage?
Very worried, because having lived through the first wave with its horrible consequences, I couldn't understand why we weren't doing things to try hard to avoid a second autumn wave. We've been telling them since we started that there will be an autumn wave. And I suppose I'd thought in the summer, with the COVID-S scenario, that had been brought on board, that we would try to do things in as much as we could to prevent an autumn wave. And nothing was happening.
Subsequently had the tier system that was introduced in October of 2020, 14th of October. You describe that as being suggestive of a lack of caution on the part of decision makers. Why is that?
Because of the way it was introduced. So if what you do is you introduce a set of tiers where in places where incidence is low, you put in controls that are insufficient to stop incidence from growing, all that will happen is that in all those places, incidence will grow. We sometimes referred to it as the levelling up scheme. It was a scheme that would allow incidence of infection to rise in many, many parts of the country.
Now, just to be clear, neither SAGE or SPI-M were asked to advise on that policy.
That's correct.
In your view, at that stage in October, moving through into November, were the tiers working or were they failing?
In October. Well, we did a big study on that afterwards. They were failing in the sense that incidence across the country, in gross measures, incidence in the country was rising, which was not what we wanted. In the parts of the country that were in tier 3 or tier 3 and a bit more, which is what some places did, you can actually see that incidence did fall in those places.
Now,
can I just add, there's nothing wrong with geographically targeted measures. It's just this business of starting off with something very low, letting it grow, putting in something that barely keeps it stable so that it grows in most places.
Thank you. I'm going to deal with the report that
Yep.
was subsequently written in due course. But if I can just keep to the chronology
Yep.
at the moment, just so that we're where we were at the
Very good.
time, or you were there at the time.
Okay, but we would have said, if we had been asked, we would have said, no, this is the wrong way round.
Now, on the 23rd of October of 2020, you emailed Sir Chris Whitty and Professor Sir Patrick Vallance. It's at INQ 62800. And what you ask here is the SPI-MO chairs and the Secretariat that are talking. And you explain here, after Sage on Thursday, SPI-M chairs and Secretariat ask themselves, how long have we got? And then you go on to set out some back of an envelope calculations that you made. Presumably those are the ones that you made after that meeting.
So
These are the calculations that you made between you at that meeting, the SPI-M
we'll have made these by correspondence. Yes,
By
between the four of us.
Thank you. What you explain here as we go on down is that you are projected to hit the level of admissions, and let's just deal with this. This is about the assumption of avoiding the first wave of peak hospital admissions. At that point, that was around the 3,100 mark, just below.
That's right.
And you've done some calculations, and you explain that you will exceed that on the 21st of November.
Yep.
And to stop that, you need to reduce the R to less than 1 by the 10th of November.
Yep.
And if you want to do better than the first wave peak, for example, 2,000 hospital admissions a day, you have to get the R below 1 by the 28th of October, so 5 days' time.
Yes. I think this was an attempt for us to arm Chris and Patrick with some numerical reasoning to say we are running out of time.
So was this an intervention, effectively, by SPI-M?
With the four of us, yeah.
Four of you.
I mean, I don't think we thought Chris and Patrick didn't agree. We were just we were searching for evidence that we could give to them to take to decision takers.
Were you trying to prompt some level of action at this stage?
Oh, yes.
Now, on the 24th of October, the following day, Wales instigated their firebreaker. Do you consider that was a success, first of all?
It was probably better than nothing. It didn't bring, if I remember rightly, we might be able to look at it actually, because there'll be a graph of it. I don't think it had a huge, it didn't cause a great decrease in cases, is my memory. On the other hand, what's the counterfactual? What would have happened if they hadn't done it?
And I've been asked to ask, do you consider that was early enough, the firebreaker in Wales, or should that have been earlier?
I think all of these things should have been done in September, so that whilst incidence was low, we could have kept it low and given ourselves time to come to terms with the fact that, yes, we are having an autumn wave. We don't know when we're getting vaccines. What are we going to do about it?
Indeed, you're subsequently tasked with the task and finish group on the impact of recent MPIs across the UK, and that involves an evaluation of the tier system, fire breaks, and other MPIs that were put in place across the four nations.
Yeah.
And you present a subsequent paper that's amended or updated slightly later with some new material, but in short, it's broadly the same paper.
Yes.
And that's presented to SAGE initially on the 19th of November of 2020.
Right.
It's the UK's four nations autumn interventions. The updated version presented to SAGE on the 26th of November 2020. And in terms of England, what it states in there, if I can just pull it up, please. Thank you very much. I believe it's towards the end. I'm afraid I've missed off the paragraph reference. But what it says is, throughout the autumn, England waited until after prevalence had increased to impose measures just about able to slow or stop epidemic growth. The inexorable outcome was high prevalence in many places and the need for 4 weeks of national restrictions.
Yes.
For the future, a more logical procedure might be to introduce measures such as Tier 2 that can be hoped to retard the growth everywhere and maintain low prevalence.
Yes.
And that's a reference back to what you've discussed in terms of how to implement it. As soon as rising prevalence is detected, measures should escalate to interventions that are associated with negative growth rates, such as Tier 3.
Yes.
So looking back at, and in terms of an evaluation of those autumn interventions, were they successful in your mind?
They were successful in some places.
And what places were they?
Tier 3, if you look at the places that were put into Tier 3 and look at the epidemic growth rate the week before they were put in Tier 3 and the week after, what you see is that the growth rate is always lower and usually negative in places that were under Tier 3. We do have to be really, really careful because these weren't experiments. Places that were in Tier 3, there was probably something pretty special about them that they needed to go into Tier 3. But this is what we had. So we need to be very careful to say this was the pattern we saw and not try really hard not to use words that imply causality. But you can look at the patterns of growth rate before and after a tier was introduced.
Then we come to the second national lockdown.
Yeah.
And you described that in your witness statement as a terrible moment. Why was that?
Well, because the thing that we had been trying to avoid by having smaller interventions at lower prevalence had to be done. And in the same, it felt like March all over again. We wait till the last possible moment. We delay and delay a decision, and then we have to slam the brakes on as hard as possible with the attendant social costs and economic costs.
At that stage, schools were also closed.
Is that right? I thought schools were open.
Maybe, have I got that wrong? It may be me that I've got that wrong, and schools were closed. Schools were certainly closed in the third lockdown.
Yeah.
It may be me.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm turning to that now, if I may. But before we get to the third lockdown after that, we then have the alpha wave that comes through in December
Yes.
Of 2020 through to January, or well, indeed the winter of 2020 into 2021. You describe some successes there in relation to surveillance and genomics.
Yes.
Can you just expand a little bit in terms of surveillance firstly?
So I think we're all really, really proud of what the Office for National Statistics did with their COVID infection survey. So we knew what prevalence of infection was across the country every week. And with actually quite a lot more detailed local investigation of what was happening with infection, much of which came actually from test and trace, we could see, right as we came out of the November lockdown, we could see straight away that there was a problem in the southeast and that infections were rising very fast in the southeast. And that was the first observation. So just there are lots more positive tests in this part of the country. What's happening? And then because of COG-UK, because of the amazing genetic studies that we had, we could see straight away that the virus that was spreading there was different. So it was a triumph of science. We not only observed right from the early days the alpha wave, we also knew why we had it.
Indeed, throughout this period, you've been armed with much greater levels of data, synthesization of data, all of those things. That surveillance testing now had a 24-hour turnaround.
Yes, we had a good picture of what was happening with this infection in our 4 countries at this stage.
Could you interrupt? I'm being asked to take a break, which is obviously going to be apparent. I'm getting very concerned about time, Ms. Cecil.
Of course.
As you know, but others may not, I have to finish at the very latest at 3:45 this afternoon, and we've got another witness. So I'm going to break now for 5 minutes to give the stenographer a rest, and please can people discuss how we ensure that I leave here at the very latest by 3:45. Thank you.
All rise.
Cecil.
Thank you. Just picking up, if I may, in December of 2020, again, SAGE meets 17th of December, says additional interventions may need to be considered, and that's 2.5 weeks before the eventual lockdown that takes place on the 5th of January. And then on the 6th of January, that's when we enter the third national lockdown, and that's when schools are also closed. Now, in respect of that, there is a communication between you and, I believe it's Professor John Medley, on the 17th of December, in which he expresses the view that you'd miss the timing of lockdown with half term. This is, as I say, the 17th of December. And today the politicians just went ahead and made policy anyway, without any guidance from SAGE. So it is finally a victory for common sense, but actually we have failed to inform policy over the last few months. Was that a view that you shared?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, as we come out of the third national lockdown, that's when you begin working, certainly just before that, with the COVID task force.
Much more closely from then on, that's right.
Indeed. And there's quite a lot of thinking that is done then in January and February of 2021. Is that fair to say?
That's right. I mean, I think the work that was led by Rob Harrison and turned into those plans to unlock from the third lockdown are a wonderful example of using scientific evidence in order to make a long-term plan. And I think the reason, if we could take a tiny bit of time to look at them, is that I think they make a useful contrast to events in 2020.
Of course. I'll just call that up briefly now. It's 238597. And we have this document, Professor, so please don't think that we won't be looking at it. And indeed, you make various of these points in your witness statement. And so even if we don't go into detail now, please be assured that that evidence will be taken into consideration in due course. If I can go to page 4, please. And for the first time, we see, in terms of the roadmap, that coming out of coming out of lockdown or easing restrictions, there is a roadmap with a test. And that's about a third of the way down. It says the assessment will be based on 4 tests. And we see A to D, vaccine deployment, that the vaccine separately is sufficiently effective in reducing hospitalisations, and that those infection rates do not risk a surge in hospitalisations, placing unsustainable pressure on the NHS, and that the assessment is not changed by variants. To be clear in relation to that, one of the priorities that is then set out later in the document on page 10, there are various objectives that also inform this roadmap out. Again, we see A, B, C and D. We see again the issue in terms of pressure on the NHS, deployment and protection of the public. But one of the aspects that is a priority is the resumption of face-to-face teaching in schools.
It's not just the priority, it's the priority.
The priority. And firstly, it's a more transparent document, but secondly, is that when we were talking earlier about the lack of strategy and aims in terms of from a SPI-M SAGE perspective with respect to modelling and providing that advice, does this accord with something that you were really looking for, something more
Yes.
like this with objectives and policy aims?
Objectives, things we're going to measure, things that we are actually able to measure, and actually we haven't found it, but the bit that says, and we're going to space these things out, we're going to space these decisions out in a way that is consistent with being able to measure how much difference did the last set of measures that we lifted make.
Indeed.
So I view this as a document that pays proper attention, and I mean that quite carefully actually, not too much, but proper attention to what can be done with all kinds of scientific evidence, including modelling.
It's a fairly lengthy document, and as you say at the outset, it does say that it's based on data, not dates. Dates are wholly contingent on data and are subject to change if the 4 tests are not met. And so what we then have is the deployment of this roadmap, and indeed later, I think it's stage 4, gets delayed because of concerns about a new variant.
That's right.
And so you have those triggers. As I say, we've heard some evidence already in relation to the roadmap out, but I just wanted to use this as an example of how you say policy objectives and advice can be aligned in a much better way in terms of
That's right.
deliverability.
Yes. Can I just say, so I think some of why this was possible was that Rob Harrison, through Task Force, put together a team from across government, bringing in advice from all sorts of different people working together at the officials level to absorb advice into government at the level of official working.
Indeed, and it's not just epidemiology that we see within the document. We also see analysis of socioeconomic impacts, mental health impacts, all other forms of inputs and issues that need to be taken into consideration. As I say, it's a substantial document in that sense. If I may now just move very briefly to just ask one very quick question in relation to children and transmission. You and John Edmonds wrote a paper on that back in October of 2020, suggesting that children indeed can be infected and do contribute to transmission. Does that remain your view?
Yes.
Thank you. And then finally, if I may just take you to the issue of testing. We know that the World Health Organization at the time was to test, and you set out within your statement that testing plays both a role at the initial stages of the pandemic, but also subsequently, both in relation to surveillance, but also in relation to it being a tool in the arsenal. In terms of testing in the early stages in March of 2020, and the decision to stop community testing at that stage, SAGE was not, am I correct that SAGE and SPI-M did not advise in relation to that?
That is correct.
And your understanding is that it was not a clinical decision, it was a resource-based decision.
That is my understanding.
Limited tests, and therefore a need to prioritise to those areas which were most in need effectively.
Yes.
Thank you. Just in relation to that World Health Organization advice and developing and less developed, or more developed and less developed countries, is it as applicable to a state such as a Western country such as the UK as it is to a developing country?
Yes, I would say at least as applicable, in that with our age distribution where we had many more elderly people than many less developed countries would have, testing was even more important for us.
And in fact, within your statement, I don't intend to take you through it now in detail because you set it out there, you refer to the experiences of both South Korea and Germany as inspiring and examples that the UK should look to.
Yes.
Thank you. And indeed, there are lessons to be learnt there in terms of their experiences and the use of that technology in testing, surveillance and tracing.
That's still my view, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. I have no further questions for you. Does my lady have any questions?
No, I don't. Thank you very much indeed. And again, I apologise for the... your evidence was certainly very illuminating.
Thank you.
Even if I didn't find the graphs electrifying. Thank you. Thank you very much for your help.
Yes, yes. Yes, please, thank you. Okay. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Do sit down, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting for too long.
That's fine.
Could you give us your full name, please?
Kemi Badenoch.
Ms. Baynard, thank you so much for attending today. Thank you for assisting the inquiry with its investigations. You have provided a statement dated the 26th of June of this year to the inquiry, and it runs to over 38 pages, and you've had this opportunity to check that. You've signed it, and it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief. And you've also provided, as we can see in the top right-hand corner, 87 exhibits. So thank you so much in relation to that. Before going into your evidence, let's briefly set out your professional background. And you're here really in your capacity at the time as Minister for Equalities, which you held that post between February 2020 and February 2022, which is the time, forgive me.
With, not quite.
Let's run.
July 2022.
Yes, which is after February 2022. Let me run through the timetable.
I see, yes.
Let me run through the timetable with you, and it's my fault if I'm confusing. So you are elected as Member of Parliament for Saffron Walden since June 2017.
Yes.
You were Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, brackets Minister for Children and Families, July 2019 to February 2020. And from February 2020 to September 21, you were Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury and Minister for Equalities. And you were on maternity leave for a short period at the beginning of that time period. So it's from February 2020 to April 2020. You were on maternity leave, which is relevant because that's at the outset of the inquiry. Later on in 2021, you became Minister of State at the Department for Levelling Up, and you held that role until July 2022. And you currently, outside the inquiry's time period, but you currently are Secretary of State for International Trade and President of the Board of Trade. And also in October 22, you were appointed as Minister for Women and Equalities.
Yes, business and trade, no, not international trade. So
Business and trade.
More has been added to the role, but yes.
Yes. So thank you so much for attending. And in terms of the role of Minister of Equalities, and that's what we're dealing with. So back during the pandemic, how would you describe the responsibilities for the Minister of Equalities?
So I would say that until I took on the role returning in April 2020, and I would say in particular June 2020, the role for Minister for Equalities was actually quite different. It was very much limited to looking at LGBT related issues and women's issues, in particular around women's economic issues, gender pay gap, and so on.
Okay. So your previous responsibilities changed significantly, and you set out what those work streams are in your statement at paragraph 9. And as an overview of the work you did, we can see that at paragraph 9 of your statement, one of the main areas was quarterly reports on progress to address COVID-19 health inequalities.
Yes.
And we'll go through those reports, not each report in detail, but we'll touch upon key features of those. You refer to ad hoc attendance at COVID-O meetings in your capacity as Minister for Equalities. And that was often discussing disproportionately impacted groups, that being a specific phrase term.
Yes.
Public health communications, a key feature also. And lastly, one of the significant features that appears from your evidence, written evidence, is increasing vaccine uptake within ethnic minority groups. In relation to that, there is a module later on in this inquiry which is going to deal with vaccines.
Right.
So we will touch upon your work, but perhaps not in the detail that would be done otherwise. In terms of the ministry, in terms of Minister of Equalities, at that stage, would it be fair to describe it as a junior ministerial role?
My role was.
Yes.
It is not, strictly speaking, and it's an odd department because it's not really a department. It's a directorate currently within the Cabinet Office, but it would move with the department of whoever the Secretary of State, who was also Minister for Women and Equalities.
Which was Liz Truss at that time?
At the time, yes. So strictly speaking, we were in DIT, as it was, the Department for International Trade, but there were recommendations made by the Commission for Race and Ethnic Disparities that the unit should stay in the Cabinet Office for consistency and continuity.
So the Equality Hub was formed later on in 2020. That was based in the Cabinet Office. We've heard about that. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the senior minister in this directorate, to use your phrase, that would have been Liz Truss,
yes.
who was the Secretary of State at that
yes.
time. The quarterly reports and inequalities and how that work was brought about. Just a little bit of context. In terms of when you were appointed as minister in February 20, joining effectively in April 2020, mm-hmm. It was around the time of the Marmot Review. Is that something that the Marmot Review 10 years on, was that a review that you had been aware of in your capacity as Minister for Equality?
Not initially. I did become aware of it later on in 2020. But I think it's probably worthwhile giving some context as to why that would be the case. The Equality Hub operates a hub and spoke model. Even before it was the Equality Hub, it became a bit more broad-based. But every department is responsible for managing its own equality work. So we would do perhaps first principles research primarily in the LGBT and women's space. We did not cover equality across the board. What we looked at was the Equality Act specifications, which is around protected characteristics and preventing discrimination rather than inequality that might arise from other areas. So this work that we started doing was basically expanding what we would normally do in order to provide support to departments like DHSC who were completely swamped at the time. So the Marmot report is not something that would naturally have come to me anyway, but I did become aware of it at some point. I can't remember exactly when.
And the last bit, just by way of context, so the Marmot Review 10 years on, the message around February 2020 was that life expectancy in England had stalled since 2010, and this had not happened since at least 1900s. And there was concern regarding the health of the nation, and that was one of the features which it was touched upon in that review 10 years on. Let's move on to the next report, which is a direct relevance to your involvement. Mm-hmm. So as you were about to take up your post, you became aware that there had been requests made of the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, in relation to a review into factors affecting the health outcomes for ethnic minority groups, especially those who are working in the front line.
Yeah.
And they commissioned a report of Public Health England, PHE, on the 4th of May 2020. And you set that out in your statement. And that report was published on the 2nd of June 2020, right. The PHE report, which we've touched upon already, disparities in the risk of outcomes of COVID-19.
Yes.
Published June 2020, there was an update in relation to that in August 2020, some updated or corrected data, which perhaps you don't need to worry about too much at the moment. In relation to the concerns you note in your statement about that report, if we look at paragraph 17, so we just have the context of how you express it, I just want to seek your clarification. So paragraph 17 of your statement, please. Thank you. The first line, the PHE report highlights some apparently significant disparities in both risk and outcomes from COVID-19. Can you assist me just with the first part, the word apparently, which on one basis maybe a caveat. What did you mean by that?
What do I mean by apparently?
In that context?
It was, this was something that had not been known or verified. And there was anecdotal information which was the reason why DHSC commissioned the report. But whether the disparities were real or not, we didn't know. What was causing them, we certainly didn't know, and that first PHE report did not explain why. But also, it's about the significance of the disparities, that you can have disparities and they're not significant. So the apparently is referring to both the fact that there were disparities, not just, but that they were significant, and it wasn't just in outcomes, but in risk as well. So the outcome you might be aware of, but also the fact that it was a risk situation was something that became apparent because of the PHE report.
As a result of the report, you were tasked by the Prime Minister at the time to investigate this and carry out work, which we'll touch upon. Let's perhaps just briefly touch upon the report itself, the PHE report, and that's at INQ *0 89740. And we see that's the front page. Page 4, please, thank you. Paragraph 1. Thank you. The third line down, it says, it confirms that the impact of COVID-19 has replicated existing health inequalities and in some cases has increased them. And the results which were carried out by the report improve our understanding of the pandemic and will help in formulating the future public health response to it. And again, just in context, if we go to page 6, please, thank you. First paragraph. Deprivation is a feature which is touched upon, an important feature. And it says people who live in deprived areas have higher diagnosis rates and death rates than those living in less deprived areas. The mortality rates from COVID-19 in the most deprived areas was more than double the least deprived areas for both males and females. This is greater than inequality seen in mortality rates in previous years. Perhaps you could go back to page 4, please. And paragraph 2. And we can move on from this report. And I'm going to summarise, if I may. It talks about the different disparities, age being one. Significantly, the older one is, the greater the likelihood, sadly, of mortality. It talks about gender, male, higher risk than female. And it talks about those in, and to use their terminology, Black, Asian and minority ethnic BAME groups having a higher risk than those in white ethnic groups. And it's really, there's also a touch upon those who are in a range of caring occupations, which is later on in this document. Those who drive passengers in road vehicles and security guards and so forth. So from your perspective, this report had highlighted significant concerns regarding a disproportionate impact.
Yes.
Particularly in relation to ethnic groups.
Yes.
I've emphasised groups as in plural. Shall we deal with terminology now, because it's a feature of your work, your concern regarding the terminology?
Yes.
What was the feedback that you gleaned from your work over Report 1 and Report 2 about the use of the term BAME as an umbrella term for ethnic groups?
It's using the term BAME masked what was actually happening within different ethnicities by lumping people who are Black with people who are Asian, very, very different groups of people. It made it harder to actually look at the underlying factors. So what the PHE report did was tell us what it was seeing. It didn't tell us why. And lumping people into one group completely obscures different bits of information, which we were then able to single out once we started splitting groups apart. What BAME basically does is summarize anyone who is not white. From a health perspective, or even just from any sort of analysis perspective, that's not particularly helpful. It is a phrase that is used if you're starting from the perspective of there is some discrimination taking place. And that is not the perspective that I wanted us to start from if we were to understand exactly what was going on.
So we recognise the terminology and it being inappropriate in that context, and that's it's a feature of your work. I think we'll see the BAME term being used throughout.
Yes.
But with that context very much in mind, I want to deal with one other matter regarding this publication, this report. Within a couple of days, it was announced in Parliament that you were going to lead this review. Were you also aware that there was concerns expressed by a number of organisations, including FEMO and British Medical Association, regarding features of the PHE report which were missing, such as recommendations and also the input from a number of groups who had exchanged and discussed their experiences.
Yes, very much so, because I also experienced quite a lot of personal abuse around the non-publication of that, despite people not understanding exactly why there was a slight delay in publishing. And the reason for that was because there were actually 2 reports written, and participants assumed that there was only one. One of them was the report which we commissioned, which we published, and the second was a sort of stakeholder report, which was less what is happening, but how people feel. And because we hadn't commissioned that, we didn't publish it straight away. It was something that went into the system for a review, understanding what was going on. And the assumption from people who didn't know that there were two separate reports was that the government was hiding something, which is very unfortunate because it immediately created some distrust, which should not have been the case, because the assumption was that this was being hidden from people for deliberate reasons rather than additional information which we hadn't commissioned, which we were taking longer to respond to.
So in relation to the messaging, using sort of political terminology perhaps, the messaging of the 2 reports, is it fair to say that the PHE report doesn't message that there's going to be another document which is going to run thereafter?
No, it did not.
Was it the case that the second report, which we're going to touch upon in a moment, the Beyond the Data report,
Yes.
was that something which was really disclosed thereafter because of this outcry regarding?
No, that's not true. First of all, this was a report that was written by an independent body. So irrespective of whether we published it or not, it could always have been published. So it wasn't because of an outcry. It was more the fact that it was being presented as missing data when actually stakeholder analysis and responses, especially the way that those responses had been captured, I felt was it's not how it should have been done. If you go out and ask people who are unhappy, why are you unhappy, you can get a totally skewed view rather than asking everyone how they feel. And as I read that report, I could see that the people who already believed that the system was set against them were the ones who were more likely to reply. I recognized many tropes in the documents and in the responses which were coming from a place not from a clinical or medical analysis, but more general social commentary, probably even more political. And I felt that we needed to make sure that we separated the 2 things. I'm very keen that we have as much rigor as possible when we analyze data, and we should separate quantitative from qualitative. And the way that it had been published meant that it wasn't easy to do so. Publishing them in stages meant that we could look at what was happening and deal with that, and then talk about the stakeholder responses after.
Thank you for the answer. Let's look at the report very briefly, and I'm just going to follow up on your answer in a moment. So if you could turn to INQ 000176354, and that's Beyond the Data, Understanding the Impact of Covid-19 on BAME Groups, and that was published on the 16th of June, 2 weeks after the first report. Perhaps if you could go to page 6, please. I'm going to just do 2 passages in relation to this. Second paragraph. Stakeholders. There was a significant amount of input in relation to this, which under the umbrella of stakeholders. And it states this: acknowledge that whilst actions are clearly being undertaken, the results of the PHE review and other studies should be used to strengthen and accelerate efforts moving forward. Clear, visible and tangible actions provided at scale were called for now, with a commitment to address the underlying factors. And lastly, in relation to this report, if you could go to page 9, please, and the final paragraph. Halfway down, we see the engagement sessions highlighted the BAME Group's deep concern and anxiety that if lessons are not learned from this initial phase of the epidemic, future waves of the disease could again have a severe and disproportionate impacts. All were united in the commitment that urgent, collaborative and decisive action is required to avoid a repeat of this in the future. I've extracted 2 parts to it. not controversial, you would agree?
Well, I don't disagree with some of the explanations and assessments, and certainly in terms of what stakeholder groups would have been feeling. That's something I very much recognise.
Were you listening to these concerns which are being expressed about how certain groups felt that they were being treated and felt that they were exposed to COVID-19?
Absolutely. So if we go back to the first clip, I think you said it was page 6 or paragraph 6. I can't remember.
That's correct. It was.
Many of the recommendations in that report were what informed our decision to publish the 4 quarterly reports. It was quite clear to me that the recommendations were things that would be needed in order to provide assurance the government was taking this seriously. But one of the reasons why I was quite keen to do the work, so I wasn't just asked to do it, I did speak to other ministers and let it be known that I would be happy to take on some of this work to help with capacity, because these were concerns that I was having as well. I am a black woman. I was reading that this was something that was impacting black people. That's my family, that's my friends, and so on. And I felt that having that personal interest would mean that I would be not just focused, but also be able to provide reassurance to many of those groups who feel that people who don't look like them can never represent them, that they were having a minister who was black, who was of the community, if you're speaking strictly on race, looking at this work and leading on it. And I was also quite keen that Professor Kevin Fenton, who at the time also a black man, head of PHE in London, worked closely and certainly was involved in how we were pulling together the terms of reference for the report and how we ended up making sure that we could communicate it in a way that would provide reassurance to people who, for whatever reason, had genuine concerns which I felt needed to be addressed.
So with that in mind, that you were listening, you were personally invested in this, you touched upon the terms of reference, and we could see these in your statements at paragraph 18, A to G. If we could bring that up in a moment, please. A number of terms of reference, but the first point, I suppose, is the terms of reference there are important to scope the work that you're dealing with and that there was accountability. Is that fair?
Yes.
And we see, I'm not going to read them all, there was a number of terms of reference, 8 in total. The first one, to review the effectiveness and impact of current actions being undertaken by relevant government departments and their agencies to directly lessen disparities in infection and death rates of COVID-19. Factors to be considered, but aren't limited to, should include age, sex, occupation, and so forth, and includes ethnicity at the end. So in terms of the first term of reference, a wide term of reference.
Yes.
Summarising the rest of them, it's to consider whether there's going to be modifications to new policy, data a key feature at terms of reference 3, to commission further data and to examine the collection of existing data and its quality, and engagement with other departmental ministers, further stakeholder engagement, and to improve public communications is at the bottom of the page.
Yes.
And at that stage, so we're June 2020, we're in a stage that we're still in lockdown number 1.
Very much so.
In your view, it was an area that still required work to improve public communications? Yes.
And in coming up with these terms of reference, I was very keen, this is probably my engineering, project management, etc. background, that we don't try and duplicate work that other people are already doing, that we provide support and assistance. We are ambitious, but not so ambitious that it is not feasible for us to deliver, and look for where there are gaps that we can add value. And by the time this this terms of reference was being drafted, I could already see the comments about people not understanding. If you remember, we had those sort of daily 5 p.m. announcements and who could shield and who didn't need to and so on. And I knew that communications was an area where there was lots of talk about people not necessarily understanding or not watching the same channels, and making sure that we were able to be as inclusive as possible. I wanted to review how we were communicating, not just what we were doing on the BBC. And that's why I added 7 to it. So what I did not want to do was try and be the Department for Health. That's not what the Equality Hub. It's not what the Equality Hub does.
At paragraph 76 of your statement, you touch upon that your work on COVID-19 disparities was primarily limited to England only. And you referenced that, as we know, health is a devolved matter in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales.
Yes.
It's a question I've been asked to clarify is the use of the word primarily. Was any of your work not exclusive to England? In other words, that it would have involved the devolved administrations?
Well, if you think about the agencies that we work with, it's NHS England, at that time it's Public Health England. That was where we had levers. What we did was communicate to the devolved administrations, here's what we're doing if you would like to replicate. As much as I would have liked to get into every corner, actually there is often resistance to that from devolved administrations. They don't want UK governments telling them exactly what to do or sticking their fingers into every pie. So it was about providing the transparency and where we could get data from devolved administrations doing so and sharing the information.
And you used the word communication and sharing information. The statement paragraph, which is open, suggests that was really having material which is available online, transparency as you describe it. Was there any more active communication with the devolved administrations?
There were certainly, when reports were published, we informed them. But given capacity, there would not have been anything to do beyond letting them know what we were doing. Communication is two-way. It's what lessons are being learned. It's how are things going. A lot of that we knew already. So there wasn't any need to provide additional activity in that space. I mean, we were at capacity. So I'm not sure what more we could have done with devolved administrations, given that they were also quite overwhelmed dealing with the pandemic in the various nations.
And one has to be realistic. You say you're at capacity twice in that answer, and it was during the heart of the pandemic. In hindsight, was this not an area, especially something like public communications, where there would have been synergies between the work you were doing and perhaps the work the devolved administrations were doing?
Yes, but I don't think that this was work that was being done in isolation. A lot of the government communications work was spread out. It was shared. They were attending the COVID-O's. They were getting updates at the same time. And I think that those four were probably sufficient for the kind of thing that we were doing.
Okay. Still on scope, we've dealt with devolved administrations, we've dealt with your terms of reference. Two important groups. The children, number one. How did work on children, how was that weaved into the work on disparities over those 4 quarterly reports?
So if we take a step back and look at the framework of the Equality Act, it's in terms of protected characteristics. Age is one of them. But our purpose is primarily to prevent discrimination and, in some cases, disproportionate impact if we think we have a lever into that. The disproportionate impact was very much on the elderly, not on children. That's something that came across very quickly and very early. So there was a limited need to look at how the disease itself was impacting children. There would have been indirect impacts such as schooling, for example, and later on, as we discovered, children living in multi-generational households, we knew were actually passing the disease on to their elderly relatives. And as we discovered that sort of information, we made sure that it was taken into account, whether in risk assessments, in communication that we were passing on. We tried to get into channels looked at by young people, letting them know that they might be at risk or they might be creating a risk for their family members. But beyond that, I would not have expected, unless you have some examples, I would not have expected children to be much further in scope for the work that I was doing.
Well, it's your answer to focus for the reasons you set out were on other groups. And when one considers age, the focus was on those who were older rather than children. That's your evidence. Disabled is the second group I wanted to ask you about, and really what part, if any, your remit included consideration of the impact on those who would fall into the category of disabled persons, disabled people?
It was limited because there was already a Minister for Disabled People, Justin Tomlinson, who I believe has already given evidence. And as I said earlier, making sure that we weren't duplicating efforts was quite important. And he already covered that part of the brief quite well. Where I did look into disability was where disability interacts more on the health, much more on the health side. So where we discovered that diabetes, for example, was a significant risk factor in terms of whether people died from the disease or not. Those sorts of things we looked at. But disability generally across the board, no, that would not have been within my remit.
What sort of interaction would you have with Justin Tomlinson, the Minister for Disabled Persons, around that time?
Update meetings, and we had Equalities Ministers meetings where we gave updates on our work across the board. The Senior Minister for Women and Equalities, as well as myself, the Minister for Women, and the Minister for Disabled People would have been present in those meetings.
Yes.
And at official level, all of that information, of course, would have been shared.
Yes. And in relation to those meetings, which were they regular or irregular, these meetings, equality meetings?
I think we had regular meetings, and then anything else that was needed in between would have been often enough. But also, I was quite keen that we didn't have meetings just for the sake of them. If we didn't have anything to say, we wouldn't have a meeting just because it was in the diary. And this is me trying to recollect. I know that when we did speak, there was an agenda item that needed communication between us. But quite often, a lot of that would have been done at official level as well. I'm also very conscious of other ministers' time, and it's not that easy to schedule things into the diary, so as and when necessary.
And so there's no mystery. You've been asked to obtain that information. You've kindly agreed that your team will go away and obtain the documentation in relation to the agendas for those meetings, any readouts.
But I would like to stress the frequency of meetings does not necessarily indicate the level of action that's taking place. You can have lots of meetings and nothing happens.
Well, actions is something we're going to talk about, but that may be a suitable moment, my lady. Perhaps I'm about to move on to a large topic.
Sorry, certainly, of course. I was just thinking about a comment about how meetings don't necessarily be productive. I shall return at 10 to 2.
Thank you, my lady.